The History of the Jesuits by Abbe Vladimir Guettée. Book 1, 1491 to 1541. Chapter 1. The founder of the Jesuit order was Don Iñigo de Loyola, known by the name of Saint Ignatius. He was a Spanish nobleman. He was born in 1491, during the reign of Ferdinand and Isabella, in the province of Guipúzcoa. His father was Señor Diógenes y de Loyola II. In this latter estate Ignatius was born, who therefore received the nickname, the surname, de Loyola. Jesuit historians relate that his mother, in honor of the birth of the Virgin, gave birth to him in a stable. Since there was a dispute about what to call him, he suddenly exclaimed, "My name is Iñigo." No one thought it right to contradict such a wonderfully expressed wish. Ignatius spent his early years in Arevalo, a town in Old Castile, with Don Juan Velasco, the king's treasurer. This nobleman adopted him. He made him a page to Ferdinand V, but the idle life at court did not suit Ignatius's character for long. He preferred military service to it. At this time, the French planned to take Navarre from the Spaniards. In 1521, they besieged Pampeluna, where the Duke of Najara was commandant. Ignatius, who had studied the art of war under this nobleman, found himself locked up in the city with him. He fought bravely. When the inhabitants opened the gates, he retired to the citadel. When the French stormed, Ignatius appeared at the breach with a sword in his hand. He was wounded in the left leg by a splinter of stone, and in the right by a cannonball. After dressing his wounds, the French transported him to the castle of Loyola, where he found proper care. His right leg was quickly set. He suffered terrible pain. The surgeons declared that some bones were out of place, and that it was necessary to break the leg again. Ignatius bravely endured this operation, but he developed a high fever. The patient fell into a violent delirium, and the doctors declared that he would not survive the night. It was the eve of the feast of the apostles Peter and Paul. Ignatius had composed a poem in Spanish in honor of Saint Peter. In his delirium he imagined that the apostle, as a reward for his praise, was descending from heaven to heal him. When the crisis passed, the patient felt better, and he believed that he was miraculously saved. The danger had passed, and his leg was almost healed, when suddenly he noticed that a bone protruded above the knee, and that he would not be able to pull on his boot properly. He absolutely wanted this bone to be sawed off, and underwent this new operation without uttering a single groan, or even changing his face. He recovered again, but again subjected himself to torture in order not to be lame. In the hope of lengthening his right leg, he forced it to be strongly stretched with an iron machine. However, he remained lame for the rest of his life. During this illness, he demanded, out of boredom, some chivalric novels, which were then the favorite reading of the Spaniards. Ignatius was especially captivated by the glorious exploits of the wandering knights, who traveled around the world at the behest of the lady of their hearts, correcting injustices, not stinting on blows of the sword to protect their homeland from the Moors, and widows and orphans from evil people. Later, Cervantes's witty parody, the magnificent Don Quixote of La Mancha, killed these novels, but in Ignatius's time the nobles were engrossed in them. Although the castle of Loyola was usually well supplied with them, when Ignatius asked for them, they were not available, and instead they brought him legends, pious novels in which saints, transformed into spiritual knights, for love of God and the Holy Virgin, committed thousands of pious follies. Ignatius became addicted to this reading, which inspired him with the idea of founding an order of spiritual knights-errant, who would imitate the saints in their virtues and the knights in their courage and bravery. However, the memory of a lady he had known at the Castilian court dispelled these pious intentions for a time. He chose her as the mistress of his heart and remained faithful to her in all his love affairs and heroic adventures. Tired of reading the lives of the saints, he gave free rein to his imagination and recalled all that the greatest heroes of knight-errantry had done to deserve the respect of their ladies. Then he dreamed only of how to do something extraordinary to deserve the favor of the beautiful Spanish woman. Then he took up his pious books again and returned to his former projects. At last his thoughts were determined. He renounced love affairs and all pleasures, chose the Blessed Virgin as the lady of his heart, and decided to begin the life of a spiritual knight-errant without delay. He immediately made a plan for his life: to go barefoot to Palestine, to dress in sackcloth, to wear a sharp hair shirt on his body instead of chain mail, to eat bread and water, to sleep on the ground, to scourge himself, to live in dark caves. These were the intentions of the new knight. While waiting for his sore leg to heal completely, he spent all his nights in prayer and tears for his sins. On one of these nights, he fell on his knees before the icon of the Blessed Virgin, swore allegiance to her, and dedicated himself to her service. Jesuit historians say that at that very moment he heard a terrible noise. The house shook and the glass in his room shattered. All this noise was made by the devil, who decided to bury under the ruins of the castle of Loyola the valiant knight who was destined to gain so many victories over him. Ignatius, with the power of the banner of the cross, forced Satan to leave the house. The devil became frightened and flew out through the wall, leaving a hole in it, which, according to the same historians, could not be repaired. The time that was not devoted to prayer and penitence, Ignatius spent in writing down with colored pencils all the most remarkable deeds and exploits of the saints. In this way they were deeply impressed on his memory, and were for him constant examples worthy of imitation. He had a vision that further confirmed him in his pious intentions. It happened on a very dark night. Ignatius, indulging in his usual activities, suddenly saw the Most Holy Virgin with the child Jesus in her arms. She was surrounded by a bright radiance. She said nothing, but her gentle look filled Ignatius with purely heavenly bliss. It seemed to him that during the appearance of the Lady of his heart, someone was purifying his soul, erasing from his memory the depraved images inscribed by his former life, and endowing him with the gift of abstinence. From that time on, he dreamed only of departure. His leg healed. His elder brother tried in vain to restrain him. Ignatius left the castle under the pretext of visiting the Duke of Neira. Having visited the latter, he sent away the 2 attendants who accompanied him, and went alone to Montserrat. It was a famous monastery, located on the top of a mountain. Due to the miraculous legends associated with it, masses of pilgrims flocked to it. There was a miraculous icon of the Mother of God. Ignatius chose this monastery as the most suitable place to prepare and dedicate himself to the service of the Blessed Virgin as her knight. On the way, a Moor joined him and entered into conversation with him. Ignatius said that he was going to Montserrat and began to praise the perfections of the Virgin Mary. When the Mohammedan began to deny the eternal virginity of Mary, Ignatius seized his sword to convince him of the truth of this dogma. The Moor was not a brave man. He ran as fast as he could. Ignatius set out in pursuit, and was already catching up with him when he found himself in a place where the road diverged in 2 different directions. One led to Montserrat, the other to the village where the Moor had disappeared. Should Ignatius overtake the infidel and cut him down, in revenge for his lady, or continue on his way to Montserrat? Not knowing what to decide, he left the matter to his mule and placed the reins on its neck. The good animal headed towards the monastery. Ignatius considered this a divine inspiration, if we are to believe the Jesuit historians. Having reached the foot of the mountain, he acquired the armor of a spiritual paladin, a robe of coarse linen, a rope for a belt, sandals, a pilgrim's staff, and a gourd bottle. He tied these things to the bow of his saddle and hastened to climb the holy mountain. On arrival at the monastery, he began a general confession of his sins, which lasted 3 days. The monk who was assigned to confess the pilgrims gave him absolution and encouraged him in his pious intentions. Ignatius immediately set about fulfilling them. He distributed his clothes to the poor, put on his spiritual armor, and left only the weapon, wishing to offer it as a gift to the Lady of his heart the following night. In the history of the great paladins, he read that before being knighted, they spent the night in vigil, and brought bitter repentance to their lady. He wished to follow their example, and he spent the night of March 24th to 25th, 1522, in the monastery church, kneeling or standing. Without taking his eyes off the image of the Mother of God, he dedicated himself to her service as her knight and hung his sword on one of the columns of her altar. Then he went to Manritz to offer there the penance of a brave paladin. Manritz was a town 3 miles from Montserrat. Ignatius lodged in a hospital and collected alms. In order not to be recognized, and also out of humility, he grew his nails, hair and beard, adopted rough manners, and neglected all cares for cleanliness. Women were afraid of him when they met him in the streets, children threw stones at him, and the population mocked him. Wise people advised locking up this poor madman, who looked more like a bear than a man. Ignatius was indifferent to all humiliations. He fasted daily on bread and water. On Sunday he ate a little boiled herbs to which he added ashes. An iron chain served him as a belt, and under his linen dress he wore a cruel hair shirt and scourged himself 3 times a day. He spent almost all nights in prayer and vigilance, and slept on the bare ground. He often went to the chapel of the Mother of God, which was in the vicinity, and in order to please his lady, he added to his hair shirt and iron chain a belt of very prickly grass. 4 months had passed since he had begun to lead this way of life, when suddenly the devil began to tempt him, and suggested to him the following thoughts. "What are you doing in the almshouse? What a disgrace for a man like you to lead the life of a beggar. Does holiness consist in dirt and uncleanliness? And is it only achieved by giving oneself alive to be devoured by various parasites? How shameful are you to so degrade your noble dignity, and so dishonor your famous family? God has given you a generous heart. He wants you to be a pious knight, but not a despised vagabond. Go away from here, show your virtues at court or in the army. There your example will be more useful than in the almshouse." Ignatius soon perceived the trap hidden in these words of the evil one, so consistent with reason. He began to indulge with even greater zeal in his pious follies, so terrible to the evil spirit. Confused by the failure of his cunning, Satan devised a new trick. He spread a rumor in Manritz that the bear-like man was a noble warrior, disguised as a beggar and doing penance. Soon, curious people began to flock to the almshouse, who, having looked closely, found something special in him, revealing his noble origin. The frightened Ignatius fled from the almshouse and, a quarter of a mile from Manritz, discovered a terrible cave, which he chose as his dwelling. It was located among wild rocks. Its entrance was blocked by dense bushes. In all probability, no one had ever been in it except snakes. Ignatius crawled into it and there subjected himself to terrible tortures. He tore his shoulders with blows of an iron chain and struck his chest with a large stone. He did not eat for several days in a row, and only when he felt the approach of fainting, he ate a little moldy bread brought from the almshouse. For some time no one knew where he had hidden. One day, passers-by found him fainting at the entrance to the cave, half dead from exhaustion, gave him some food and brought him back to the almshouse in Manritz. There he again found the devil, who tried to discourage him and make him fall into the sin of pride. Jesuit historians, no doubt accurately, relate the dialogues of their founder with Satan, from which Ignatius always emerged with honor. Father Rabadinira reports that he gained victory over the evil spirit, especially by the power of prayer, and has preserved for us the one with which Ignatius turned to God in the moment of his strongest temptation. "Help me, Lord, help me," Ignatius exclaimed. "I expect peace of mind from you alone. However, I would not refuse a guide sent by you, and even if you gave me a little dog to guide me and calm my agitated soul, I would obey it as my master and follow it as a guide." In spite of this touching prayer, God did not even send him a little dog, and he fell into such despair that he was ready to throw himself out of the window. The Dominicans of Manresa, out of pity, tried to calm him down a little, but in vain. Finally, he defeated the devil and calmed down. As a reward for the trials he had endured, the Lord sent him apparitions, revelations, and ecstasy. Sometimes he revealed to Ignatius the mystery of the Holy Trinity. Sometimes he explained to him the order of the universe, or the mystery of the Eucharist. He lived simply with Jesus Christ and his mother. The sacraments were quite understandable to him. He assured me that after all the revelations he had received, the Holy Scripture could disappear without any harm to him, Ignatius. However, the devil, from time to time, rewarded himself for his defeats. Once, by the way, he beat up a brave knight, taking him by surprise. Another time, he almost strangled him. The most remarkable phenomenon, among many other miraculous events, was a state of ecstasy lasting a whole week, during which the Lord revealed to Ignatius the plan of the order of spiritual knights, of which Ignatius was to be the founder. As a result of ecstasies and revelations from above, as well as the struggle with Satan, Ignatius fell ill. Upon recovery, he understood that the time had come to replace the feet of repentance with the feet of instruction. The Lord had not given him so much knowledge so that he would keep it for himself. Therefore, he took off his linen clothes and chain, cut his hair, beard, and nails, washed himself, put on a robe of coarse woolen material, and began to preach. There is a custom in the Church, according to which no one preaches without the permission of the bishop. But, of course, a person who is in direct communication with heaven is not subject to the usual rules. Ignatius not only preached, but also wrote a book, Spiritual Exercises, to prepare knights for his order. According to Father Louis Dupont III, God himself revealed these exercises to Ignatius, and the Blessed Virgin assisted him in writing this book. It is a pity that Father Dupont does not say how he learned of this astonishing fact. Be that as it may, Ignatius, who was imbued with martial and chivalrous ideas, dreamed only of a spiritual army, of wars and fierce battles, of knights clad in strong armor, and advancing in close ranks against Satan, under the banner of the cross. The Book of Exercises contains indications of the subjects of prayer and some rather dry rules, mainly concerning private confession. Some consider this book perfect, others see nothing special in it, others even find errors in it, especially on the question of the Incarnation. Having written his Book of Exercises, Ignatius left Manritz and went to the Holy Land. There he intended to engage in a fierce struggle against Mohammedanism and convert all Muslims to Christianity. His hopes were not justified. He did not stay long in Palestine and did not perform a single feat there worthy of such a valiant knight. On his return to Europe, he went to Spain with the purpose of studying there first grammar and then theology. It would seem that the man with whom God himself and the Blessed Virgin collaborated in the composition of his Book of Exercises, who understood the essence of the sacraments, did not need either grammar or theology. But since the Jesuit writers assert that Ignatius, possessing knowledge inspired from above, still had to learn even the first rudiments of the language, we are forced to believe what they report about their holy founder, even when they contradict themselves. Ignatius was 33 years old when he began to study grammar in Barcelona. He had no difficulty in declension, but the devil was waiting for him at the conjugation. His trap was all the more difficult to detect because it was covered up by love for God. Instead of conjugating the verb amo, Ignatius uttered a declaration of love. "I love you, Lord," he exclaimed. "You love me to love, to be loved, and nothing more." These impulses did not help him to master the mechanism of conjugations. He noticed his poor progress and attributed the blame for it to the devil. To defeat the wiles of the enemy, he took Artebal, his teacher, to the church of Santa Maria sur Mer, knelt before him and vowed to continue his studies, no matter what obstacles Satan might create for him. He asked his master to look upon him as a minor and to treat him as such, giving him lessons every day and punishing him with the whip if he did not learn them. When he began to understand Latin a little, he was given the translation of Erasmus's Christian Warrior. But as soon as this book fell into Ignatius' hands, all his visions ceased, from which he concluded that Erasmus, as an author, was displeasing to God. For this reason, he subsequently forbade the reading of this book to his spiritual knights, who from that time on blasphemed it as much as they could. Christian writers were not so strict. They always honored this famous author as an enlightened priest who understood that in the 16th century the Church needed reform, and as an excellent writer who did the greatest honor to literature. Ignatius, who studied grammar, was more perceptive, and therefore his followers assert that, on this question, as on many others, he received inspiration from above. After studying grammar for 2 years in Barcelona, Ignatius considered himself prepared for philosophy and theology. To study these sciences, he went to the University of Alcalá de Henares, which had just been founded by Cardinal Jiménez. While studying grammar in Barcelona, Ignatius acquired several disciples. They wanted to follow him to Alcalá, but Ignatius did not dare take them with him, fearing to arouse the suspicion of the Inquisition. Only Callistus, Artiaga, and Cáceres went with him. In the hospital of Alcalá, he met a fourth companion. This was a young Frenchman named Jean, page of the Viceroy of Navarre, and was admitted to the hospital for treatment of a wound. Ignatius inspired in him a great aversion to court life and a strong devotion to spiritual chivalry. The teacher and his students wore long gray caftans and hats of the same color. They were given a room out of charity, and they ate alms. Ignatius earned his board and room by a brave deed that is worth telling. There was a room in the hospital in which no one could live, because it was full of devils who made a terrible noise every night. The head of the hospital offered this room to Ignatius, warning him of what was happening there. Ignatius had fought the devil too often to be afraid of him, and he boldly accepted the room. However, when he heard the hellish noise, his heart sank, but overcoming his fear, he stood up and cursed Satan and his angels. "If the Lord has given you the right to harm me, I am ready, strike. But if you have received no right from God, flee, damned creatures, and leave me alone." At these words, the devils turned into a hasty flight, and never returned to celebrate their Sabbath in the room where the holy man had cursed them. As a reward for the important service he had rendered, the head of the hospital gave Ignatius not only a room, but also food. Nevertheless, Ignatius continued to ask for alms, not for himself, but for the poor who were ashamed to stretch out their hand, and for the infirm who could not leave their homes. At the same time, he attended lectures at the University of Alcalá. There they read the logic of Dominic Soto, the physics of Albertus Magnus, and the sayings of Peter Lombard. Despite all his diligence, he understood neither the authors nor their interpreters. There is reason to believe that these authors, like Erasmus, were cursed by heaven, and therefore unworthy of being understood by so holy a man. Be that as it may, Ignatius and his companions left the university and became teachers for the people and small children. They taught the catechism and admonished corrupt schoolchildren. In addition, several hypocritical women joined Ignatius as students. Such a resounding success attracted the attention of the Toledo Inquisition. Several members of the terrible tribunal went to Alcala, thinking to catch adherents of the sect of the Illuminati, but they found something quite different. Convinced of the ignorance of the new scholars, they handed the whole matter over to Jean Rodrigue Figueroa, the senior vicar of Alcala, and returned home. The Lord Vicar ordered an investigation into the lives and morals of the accused, and released them, forbidding them only to dress alike. Hardly had Ignatius got rid of this trouble, when he fell into another, no less. Among his followers in Alcala were two ladies, inflamed with a noble passion for spiritual chivalry. It seemed to them that they could imitate the one whom they had chosen as their leader. Ignatius tried in vain to dissuade them. They positively refused to admit the possibility of admiring the great and beautiful deeds of others, and not doing the same. They decided that Ignatius was inconsistent, wishing to prevent them from doing what he himself considered good, left their homes and began to lead the life of wandering knights, making on foot, and in the clothes of beggars, two famous pilgrimages, to Our Lady of Guadalupe and to the Shroud of Jean. Soon, all of Alcala was talking about the departure of these ladies, and since they knew that they were followers of Ignatius, all responsibility for their act fell on him. The news of this reached the vicar of the Inquisition, who had Ignatius imprisoned. The two ladies, who had returned to Alcala after a 40-day absence, were interrogated and testified that Ignatius had not only not encouraged them to perform this feat, but had tried in every way to dissuade them. Then the vicar released him, but ordered him and his companions to dress like all the other students, and forbade them to teach until they had completed their 4-year course in theology. This sentence could not please a man to whom the Lord had given understanding of the greatest mysteries. He hastened to leave Alcala and went to Salamanca, where there was a very famous theological school. He was accompanied by 4 disciples. On the way, Callistus exchanged clothes with a ragged wanderer, and arrived in Salamanca in a too short caftan and a dirty, wide-brimmed hat, which gave him a ridiculous appearance. Ignatius and his disciples began preaching again, as they had done at Alcala. The people flocked to their talks in crowds, and some ladies chose them as their spiritual guides. The Dominicans of the monastery of St. Stephen wanted to know for sure who these people were who had made such a noise. Ignatius chose one of these monks as his spiritual father. One day the latter invited him to dine with him. He accepted the invitation and went to the monastery with Callistus. After dinner, the assistant abbot, together with the confessor and another monk, took the 2 spiritual knights to a secluded place and began to interrogate them very persistently about their education and the mission they ascribed to themselves. Ignatius refused to answer. "I will make you talk," said the assistant abbot, and immediately ordered his guests to be locked up, and reported everything to Don Frias, the senior vicar of the Bishop of Salamanca, who, without any trial or investigation, put the 2 arrested men in prison, chaining them together at the feet with one common thick chain. They sang spiritual songs all night. The next day Frias interrogated them. Ignatius handed him his book, Spiritual Exercises, and indicated the places of residence of his other 3 comrades, who were also arrested and imprisoned, without being able to communicate with either Ignatius or Callistus. Frias read the Spiritual Exercises and submitted the book to the examination of 3 doctors of theology. After 22 days of imprisonment, the teacher and the students were tried. The court forbade them to speak about the difference between mortal sin and venial sin without having completed a 4-year course of theology. It was found that on this issue, the teaching of the Spiritual Exercises was not entirely correct. However, it was declared that the accused were not heretics and were of good conduct. In addition, they were allowed to teach the law of God. Ignatius could not reconcile himself to such restrictions on his apostolic activity, and decided to leave Spain, where he was so little appreciated. It seemed to him that the Lord was inspiring him with the idea of going to France and continuing his studies at the University of Paris. He communicated his intention to his disciples, who refused to follow him. Then he set out alone, loading his donkey with his books and student belongings. Arriving safely in Paris, he, at the age of 37, resumed the study of Latin grammar. When one of his countrymen stole the money he had brought from Spain, Ignatius moved into the almshouse of St. James and began to live on alms. He had 3 followers who sold all their property, even their books, and began to beg like him. This conversion caused a great stir in Paris. Matthew Ori, a Dominican and Grand Inquisitor, examined Ignatius, found him innocent, and released him acquitted. However, in Paris alms were given sparingly, and the spiritual knights were in danger of dying of hunger. Ignatius went to Flanders and thence to England to collect some funds for them. His labors were crowned with such success that he acquired everything necessary for several years, both for himself and for his companions. They all resumed the studies that had been so neglected during these wanderings. Of the 18 months he spent as a student at Montaigu, Ignatius studied for no more than 6. Nevertheless, he found it possible to enroll in the philosophy course at St. Barbara's. He did not study so much as he played the part of an apostle in relation to his fellow students, who, out of curiosity or for other reasons, followed him to church, where he was doing his exercises. The professor, noticing that his lecture hall was almost completely empty, complained to the head of the college. Ignatius was almost flogged in the presence of teachers and students, but since, in fact, his only guilt was that he carried away his comrades with his spiritual exercises, the director did not dare to punish him for this, and even declared in the presence of all the members of the college that Ignatius was a saint. However, after this, Ignatius' admirers left him alone, and he was able to devote himself more seriously to his scientific studies. After completing his course in philosophy, he received a master's degree and began to attend lectures on theology at the Dominicans on St. Jacob's Street. Despite his scientific studies, he was haunted by the idea of founding an order of spiritual knighthood. Twice abandoned by his followers, he did not lose courage and took up the matter again. His labors were crowned with success, and the new disciples he acquired became the pillars of the famous order whose history we are about to write. The first was Peter Lefebvre, from a village in Savoyard. He was a gentle and defenseless man, and Ignatius had no difficulty in winning him over to his side. Not so with François Xavier, a young professor of philosophy at the College of Beauvais, passionately fond of learning and ambitious. When Ignatius conceived the idea of converting him, he met at first with nothing but contempt and ridicule, but he conquered him by flattering his vanity, and by converting into zeal for the salvation of souls the ambition that was eating away at him. Thus Xavier became his second disciple. He was a Spaniard. They were soon joined by Jacob Lainez, Alphonse Salmeron, Nicolas Alphons, nicknamed Bobadilla, and Simon Rodriguez, so that Ignatius found himself at the head of 6 knights. One day he assembled them all and delivered a pathetic speech in which he proposed to make a spiritual conquest of Palestine. This plan pleased them, and it was decided that, after completing their course of theology, they would go to Venice to take ship there. Furthermore, if they were unable to leave, they decided to come to Rome, throw themselves at the feet of the Pope, and offer him their services. Ignatius had already been deserted by his followers twice, so this time he thought it necessary to take some precautions and proposed to his new companions to bind themselves by an oath. They agreed to this, and appointed a day for taking this oath in a solemn manner. On August 15, 1534, the feast of the Assumption of the Virgin Mary, Ignatius and his 6 companions went to Montmartre. It was not without reason that this particular day had been chosen. The Knight of the Virgin wished that his entire order should choose her as their lady and dedicate themselves to her service in a very special way. Together with his companions, he descended into the underground chapel where, according to tradition, Saint Denis and his followers had been beheaded. Lefebvre, recently ordained a priest, celebrated Mass and gave them communion. They took a vow and formed a small community, living in the same house and keeping a common table. After some time, Xavier, Lainez and Salmeron decided to go to Spain to put their family affairs in order before dedicating themselves to the new life they had chosen. Ignatius was afraid that they might be dissuaded from it, and under the pretext of not wanting to tear them away from their studies, he offered to personally settle their affairs. Before leaving, he made an appointment for them in Venice for January 25, 1537. On his arrival in Spain, Ignatius refused to live in the castle of Loyola, despite his brother's requests, and chose to live in the almshouse at Azpeitia. If we are to believe the Jesuit historians, he proved to be a prophet in his own country and eradicated all vices there. His sermons were so successful that the churches were too small for his listeners. He was forced to preach in the open air and, an amazing thing, although his voice was weak, it was clearly heard at a distance of 300 paces. The same historians note, as one of the most amazing phenomena, his success in the fight against concubinage of priests. These gentlemen changed their morals, at the word of Ignatius, who persuaded the judges to issue the strictest laws against persons indulging in debauchery. While Ignatius was working these miracles in Spain, Lefebvre, who had replaced him in Paris as head of the community, had acquired 3 new disciples through the spiritual exercises: Claude Le Guet of Annecy, Jean Cotter of the Diocese of Embrun, and Pasquier Brouet of Amiens. They took their vows in Montmartre on the day when the other 6 disciples of Ignatius first repeated their oath. Thus the order of spiritual knights consisted of 10 members, including the general, when the time came for the meeting in Venice. Ignatius went there towards the end of 1535, after a journey full of events, certainly astonishing, but little deserving of a place in history. In Venice he met some Spaniards, whom he recruited into his company. Jacob Joses immediately entered the order, the others did so later, after the Pope had sanctioned the order. Ignatius's successes in Venice became known to Peter Carafa, Bishop of Theatine, who later ascended the papal throne under the name of Paul IV. Disappointed by the immorality of the clergy, this bishop had just founded an order of monastic churchmen clerics, called Theatines, whose main goal was the reform of the morals of the clergy. Carafa hoped that Ignatius and his companions would enter this order, and he did him a great service in one unpleasant matter. A rumor had spread in Venice that Ignatius had been condemned as a heretic in Alcala, Salamanca, and Paris, and that only flight had saved him from the stake. This matter was sent to the Nuncio Virali. Carafa made such a testimony in favor of Ignatius's orthodoxy that the Nuncio pronounced a verdict of acquittal. The companions of Ignatius who remained in Paris arrived in Venice before the appointed time. Since there were rumors of war between Francis I, King of France, and Emperor Charles V, they decided to set out immediately, fearing that the war would make any journey impossible. They left France on November 15, 1536, and they set out for Germany. They were dressed like simple travelers, a staff, a leather knapsack with papers, that was all their property. On the way, they sang hymns and litanies with rosaries in their hands, as if challenging the Protestants. More than once they had to break spiritual spears with the priests of the cities they passed through. Lainez, a very skillful dialectician, distinguished himself in these skirmishes. Xavier was mainly engaged in works of mercy. He was an ardent soul, an enthusiastic imagination, but a straightforward heart. They arrived in Venice on January 8, 1537, and spent some time caring for the poor in hospitals. Owing to the alliance of the Venetian Republic, Charles V, and the Pope against the Turks, a journey to the Holy Land became unthinkable. After waiting more than a year, our spiritual knights decided to go to Rome. Ignatius sent their first Lefebvre and Xavier to prepare the way. He himself did not dare to go there, since the Bishop of Thate, Carafa, had been summoned to Rome as a cardinal. This prelate was angry with Ignatius because he did not want to enter his order. Xavier and Lefebvre were well received by Paul III. In Rome they collected quite a large donation, and asked the Pope for the privilege of receiving ordination from any bishop at any time and in any place. They took advantage of this permission, were ordained priests in Venice, and began to preach in the surrounding towns. To attract people, they used the same methods as the buffoons, but those who came to laugh, left in tears about their sins. Confident of a good reception from the Pope, Ignatius soon set off for Rome with Lefebvre and Lainez. The Jesuits say that, 2 miles from Rome, he fell into an ecstasy, during which he saw God the Father, who introduced him, Ignatius, to his son Jesus Christ, and that he received new instructions regarding the order and its name. When zealous disciples speak of their patriarch, then under their pen revelations, ecstasies, illuminations are repeated endlessly. All the powers of heaven and hell serve him. Thus, for example, when Rodriguez decided to exchange the order for Hermetism, a giant appeared from the other world, blocking his path and threatening him with a sword. Ignatius himself learned of this in a miraculous vision and supported the courage of his weak comrade. We do not undertake to relate thousands of similarly astonishing incidents from the life of Ignatius. It is not necessary to reveal to the eyes of the uninitiated so many miraculous deeds, which only those well disposed to him can appreciate. Ignatius arrived in Rome towards the end of 1537. Paul III received him favorably and appointed Lefebvre to lecture on Holy Scripture and Lainez on scholasticism at the Collegium della Sapienza. Ignatius devoted himself to the correction of morals in the city of Rome. Paul III was not mistaken about the necessity of such a reform. and to this end he issued a bull which had no effect. Then, in 1537, he commissioned a commission of prelates and cardinals to indicate the principal aspects of the matter to which he should pay attention. The commission presented a report in which the ulcers of the church were laid bare. 28 abuses were noted. At the head of the commission stood Cardinals Contarini, Carafa, Sadolet, and Polis. These names give a high significance to the report on the reform of morals. An examination of this document will show the state of the Roman court at the time when Ignatius and his companions arrived there. The choice of prelates and priests is not done with sufficient care and caution. Immoral, incapable, and often too young people are admitted to these sacred duties. From this arise numerous scandals, contempt for the clergy, a decrease and almost disappearance of due respect for the divine service. The most serious abuses are observed in the distribution of spiritual places, such as dioceses and parishes. The benefit derived from them by the persons appointed is taken into account, and not the good of Christ's flock. From this it happens that parishes are appointed in places where priests never live, whose language they do not know, and limit themselves to collecting income without caring about their duties. The great rule is forgotten that he who enjoys spiritual income or estates has the right only to what is necessary, while everything else belongs to the poor and the church. Parishes and churches are traded like goods in order to receive more income and get rich. Some bishops retain only the title and the benefits that go with it, leaving all the work to their assistants without the title and with the least remuneration. To the great temptation of the faithful, the law that forbids the children of priests to inherit their fathers' parishes is not observed. Another abuse consists in the promise of a place, in case of its vacancy, as a result of which those who have been promised parishes in advance wish death to the one who uses them. What shall we say, add the papal commissioners of the so-called incompatible benefices, that is, those which cannot be enjoyed simultaneously by the same person. This ancient custom is now little observed, and to the shame of religion, it is not uncommon to meet with men occupying the episcopal seats in several dioceses at once. Even cardinals, who should live in Rome, sell their votes to princes, receiving from them dioceses in which they cannot live, in spite of the law which obliges them. Can there be a more pitiable spectacle than churches deserted almost everywhere by bishops who are nothing but mercenaries? According to canonical rules, a bishop cannot leave his diocese longer than 3 months, and yet we see that some bishops are absent for whole years. Crimes are not punished. The guilty know how to use money to avoid responsibility for their actions. There are no less disorders in the monasteries. They are well known and create great temptation among the people. We believe that the monasteries should be destroyed, not in a hasty and violent manner, but by prohibiting the admission of new members. The old monks will die out, and then they can be replaced by new ones. We even think that it would be necessary to remove from the monasteries now all but those who have taken the great tonsure. The abuses are enormous in the women's monasteries. They can be eliminated only by removing the monks from the management of these monasteries and transferring their management to people from whom the nuns are not in any danger. The commission noted the following as requiring immediate and strict correction: the bad direction of some universities, collections of donations made by monks and the superstitious customs accompanying them, simony, that is, the sale and purchase of sacred objects, abuse of indulgences, hired chaplains. Having pointed out these general shortcomings, the commission drew the attention of Paul III to those abuses that were committed at the papal court, such as the negligent attitude of priests to their duties, moral licentiousness, discord, negligent maintenance of the sick and the poor. The correction of all these defects was postponed to another time. In the Middle Ages, the papal government did not take the initiative in reform. It preferred to close its eyes until the people, tired of all kinds of abuses, rose up to fight them. Then all boundaries were crossed, and instead of reforms, revolutions appeared, the immediate consequences of which were deplorable. Those who benefited from abuses saw in the revolution an attack on their property. Others looked upon it as a legitimate defense of the oppressed against the oppressors, and as a punishment sent by God for the guilty. If the papacy had been a wise government, it would have satisfied the needs of the people by gradual reforms, but such was not the government of Paul III. The commission's report was respectfully filed away. Paul III wanted to make reforms, but without any effort. He considered his task as pope and sovereign accomplished by inviting some private individuals to undertake the reform of the clergy and people. That is why he approved and permitted the order of ecclesiastical monks of Cardinal Carafa. Upon Ignatius' arrival in Rome, the Pope hastened to involve him in the work of moral reform. While Lefebvre and Lainez were lecturing at the College della Sapienza, Ignatius began with great courage the reformation of Roman morals. To do him justice, from the time of his conversion he had become a lover of virtue and had led an exemplary life, and his zeal was sincere. An ardent imagination, occupied with exaggerated pictures of knight-errantry, often gave his actions an eccentric character. Besides, many things were attributed to him by his disciples, who thought that they would thereby increase his glory. However that may be, Ignatius was a virtuous man, sincerely desiring to correct human vices, and who founded his order of spiritual knights solely for the purpose of combating evil by preaching, of uprooting abuses and insults, of destroying the wiles of the devil, and of restoring to the Church all her glory. We shall see how faithful the disciples remained to the idea of their master. Ignatius, to whom Pope Paul III had entrusted the task of moral correction of the Romans, called his other companions to his aid. One of them, Jesuits, died in Padua, where he had been preaching with Counter. In life, Jesuits was a dark and very ugly man. After death, he became so white and handsome that Counter could not stop admiring him and kept kissing him. At that time, Ignatius, who was in Monte Cassini, saw the soul of Jesuits ascending to heaven in a crown of bright rays. Moreover, at the liturgy, at the words of the priest, "Holy things to the holy," he saw the heavens opened in Jesuits, who seemed more radiant than all the other saints. This vision filled Ignatius with such bliss that he wept for 2 days from emotion. After this miracle, the entire order decided that God was especially favorably disposed towards spiritual knights and made them the greatest saints in his kingdom. At the same time, Ignatius acquired several new followers, including Strata, who had gained great fame in Spain as a skilled orator. The fellowship grew so much that it was possible to think of forming from it a monastic order, sanctioned by the Pope. Towards the end of Lent 1538, all the members of the new community gathered in Rome. They all lived together in the house of the nobleman Quirino Garzonio. Here the first general meeting took place, at which Ignatius delivered a speech worthy of a general. Since spiritual knights are destined by God for the spiritual conquest of the world, it is undoubtedly necessary to form from them an army that could exist until the end of the world. There can be no doubt that the new order is promised immortality, since God the Father and Jesus Christ himself have positively given Ignatius their word on this. This speech made the best impression on those present, who decided that it was necessary to prepare the Pope and obtain permission from him. This was all the more necessary since Paul III, in despair at the evil caused to the Church by monks, firmly decided not to allow the formation of new monastic communities. However, the assembly did not lose hope of being able to appease the Pope and immediately began to think up a name for the new order. "I advise," said Ignatius, "to call it the Order of Jesus. This, the highest of all names, was divinely inspired to me during my solitude in Manres, and was recently confirmed when, near Rome, God the Father introduced me to his Son for. Therefore, dear brothers, we have nothing to seek for another." We think that Ignatius, in his ecstatic mood, did not consider his words as strictly as he would have done at another time, and that he really considered his visions to be true. Otherwise we would have to admit that he was an impostor and an atheist. We must assume that his feverish ardor carried him beyond the bounds of prudence, or else we must think that his chroniclers, wishing to make of him a person especially blessed by visions and revelations, pass on to us as facts the fruits of their imagination. Ignatius was not a theologian and could not have successfully completed a university course, despite the supernatural abilities that he allegedly received from above. But still, he was undoubtedly sufficiently versed in theology to know that he could not, without blasphemy, say that he was united by God the Father to God the Son. Taking these words in a strict sense, and comparing them with some places in the spiritual exercises, one can come to the conclusion that Ignatius had, regarding the divinity of Jesus Christ, vague and unorthodox ideas, for which his disciples Hardouin and Baruch were subsequently condemned. Thus, the Nestorianism of the Jesuits is of quite ancient origin. 5. The disciples of Ignatius believed, of course, in his revelations. They approved of the name, Order of Jesus, given from above. All Jesuits maintain that it was given by revelation, and thought only of how to obtain permission from the Pope. Paul III was in Nice, where he was drawing up a peace treaty with Francis I and Charles V. While awaiting his return, the followers of Ignatius began to preach, choosing as the theme of their speeches the frequent communion of the holy mysteries. The most serious sinners found that, according to the teaching of the new apostles, It was very easy to prove worthy of frequent communion, and the holy table, until then empty, soon began to be besieged by those wishing to partake. While spending their days instructing the people, Ignatius and his companions devoted part of their nights to the organization of the future order and devised the first principles of its charter. They decided that in addition to the vows of poverty and chastity they had already taken, they would also take a vow of obedience, that at the head of the order there would be a general, elected for life and vested with unlimited power. In order to induce Paul III to give his consent, they decided to add to the 3 vows common to all monastic communities a 4th, a vow to obey the Pope and go wherever he orders, without even worrying about the necessities of travel. Having drawn up the outline of the statute, Ignatius drew up a memorandum, which Cardinal Contarini presented to the Pope. Paul III read it. He was especially flattered by the 4th vow, which seemed to promise to give the Holy See a whole army devoted, always ready to fly to where the danger was greatest. He exclaimed, "Here is the finger of God." Ignatius asked the Pope to confirm what he had said in writing, but Paul III would not decide anything without consulting 3 cardinals. The examination of the new statute was first entrusted to Bartholomew Guettée, a very learned theologian and canonist. Strictly observing the decrees of the Lateran and Lyons Councils 6, which forbade the formation of new monastic orders, he did not even want to look at the memorandum presented. "Whatever the new order may be," he said, "the Church has no more need of it than of many others, of which she would be glad to be rid." The other 2 bishops, consulted by the Pope, were of the same opinion. Ignatius did not lose courage. He managed to win over Paul III, who entrusted his companions with various duties until the dissolution of the order. At the request of Juan III, the King of Portugal, Rodriguez and François Xavier went to him. The latter subsequently went to the East Indies. Ignatius remained in Rome and continued to petition for permission for his order. The Jesuit Rabatinera relates that, despairing of any human assistance, Ignatius devoted himself to prayer, fasting, and penance. But even this was of no avail until he hit upon the idea of promising God 3,000 masses if his wish were fulfilled. As soon as this vow was made, according to the same historian, Cardinal Guettée suddenly changed, without knowing how or why, read the note which he had previously refused to look at. His previous doubts were dispelled, and the new order seemed to him positively necessary for the struggle against heretics. The other cardinals agreed with his opinion, and Pope Paul III, who immediately saw the finger of God in this matter, gave the bull of permission, September 27, 1540, on the basis of a simple statement of the statutes, which had not yet been worked out. This entire statement was included in the bull, and may be summarized as follows. The Order of Jesus is composed of those who wish to fight under the standard of the cross and to serve only the Lord and the Roman Pontiff, his vicar on earth. They must take a vow of chastity, poverty, obedience to the general, and submission to the Pope. The general has unlimited power. He will draw up the rule, in agreement with the majority of the members of the order. His power in governing the order is unlimited. Here is the passage referring to the vow of poverty. We wish all the members in general, and each of them in particular, to take a vow of poverty, and we declare that even for the maintenance of the order or for its benefit, no member, either individually or collectively, has the right to acquire real estate, government securities, or any income whatsoever, but must be content with alms to satisfy his immediate needs. However, they may have their own colleges at the universities, which own income, land property and capital used to satisfy the needs of students. At the same time, the general of the order retains full administrative power, both over these properties and over the students, regarding the selection, refusal, acceptance, or removal of the superiors and the students themselves, and is in charge of all matters related to the management of the college, but in such a way that neither the students could abuse this property, nor the order itself could appropriate it for itself and turn it to the detriment of the students. The students were young men who were destined to enter the order if they showed the required qualities. We shall see later how the Jesuits interpreted these rules of poverty, and how an order founded on poverty became the richest that the Church has ever had. In the presentation presented to the Pope, Paul III saw only piety and holiness, and gave his permission, leaving the new monks the right to create, at their own discretion, institutions that they would consider useful for the order. He limited to 60 the number of members who could be accepted into the new order or be attached to it as egregious. Note that the Jesuit rule had not yet been written when Paul III authorized their order, which he could judge only by its general outline, which differed from the rules of other monastic orders in only one thing: the vow of obedience to the Pope. In approving the new order, the Pope had in mind only the creation for the Holy See of a devoted and disciplined army, whose help might prove necessary in the exceptional circumstances in which the Church then found itself. The Protestants were then engaged in a struggle against it which was all the more dangerous because they had public opinion and the learned on their side. For the latter, as for the people, reform was a social necessity, and in the name of this reform the Protestants entered into a ceaseless and cruel struggle with Catholic society in general and with the Roman court in particular. Paul III understood that there was something true and just in their attacks. Otherwise he would not have commissioned a commission to expose the abuses and indicate the means of suppressing them. But for some fatal reason the representatives of the papal authority, as well as the majority of rulers in general, almost never initiated reforms. The most judicious popes, who understood the necessity of reforms well, were held back by thousands of private considerations and interests. They postponed reforms for an indefinite time, until at last the people, wearied by suffering, rose up in all their might, broke down all barriers, forcibly snatched what was denied them, and crossed boundaries which, in a calmer state, they would not have crossed. So it was in the 16th century. For a long time already, wise and far-sighted people had been demanding a reform of the Church, both in the person of its head and its members. The highest spiritual authorities had already recognized its necessity, in principle, at the Council of Vienne. The councils of Pisa, Constance, Basel worked on this issue. Vincent Ferrier, Cardinal Julian, Gerson, Peter D'Ailly, Clemenges and many others energetically and eloquently pointed out the vices that disfigured the Church. In their opinion, the Pope, bishops, monks, the entire clergy were covered with crimes, like a severe leprosy. Shamelessness, avarice, simony, ignorance distinguished those who should have shone with all the virtues. As for the doctrine itself, the dogmas almost disappeared, under a mass of controversial, obscure, often ridiculous questions with which they were surrounded by theologians and scholastic philosophers. These questions, more than the dogmas themselves, formed the subject of instruction, and although, in essence, the true Catholic doctrine remained pure, for the majority it appeared only as controversial questions, which alone occupied the schools. Not receiving due instruction, the people satisfied their religious needs by indulging in superstitions worthy of paganism. It must be said in truth, the clergy themselves encouraged these superstitions, by means of which they collected enormous revenues from the people. When Luther pronounced the word reform, it echoed in all hearts. Society cared very little about those theological concepts with which he wanted to replace the generally accepted ones. Only the reform itself attracted all nations to him, and produced in the Church that great revolution which had long been foreseen, and which the spiritual authority did not want to prevent by suppressing abuses. In Germany, revolutionized by Luther, there was a fire. In France, Calvin acquired numerous adherents. Following Zwingli, almost all of Switzerland left Catholicism. The most famous university professors raised the banner of science against the Church. Some of them openly went over to Luther and Calvin, others, without breaking with the Church, approved of the reformers and sympathized with them. As a result of scientific and literary relations of some with others, a certain community of ideas and views was born, which greatly contributed to the reform movement, which had become impossible to direct. Meanwhile, the dominant thought of the clergy, at the appearance of Protestantism, was the desire to eradicate it. The idea of reforms in the Catholic environment was secondary and could not develop amidst the obstacles that met it on all sides. The main effort was to set the rulers against the new movement and to develop the inquisitorial system. At the moment when these thoughts were guiding the princes of the Church, Ignatius appeared with his order of spiritual knights, who swore to go wherever the Pope sent them to fight the enemies of the Church. It is not surprising that Paul III looked upon him as a reinforcement sent by Providence. The first steps of the order were rather uncertain. For some time it was not even decided what to call the new knights. In Italy they were almost everywhere confused with the Theatines. In Nola they were called Jesuits, in Ferrara, Scofiati. In Bologna, priests of St. Lucia. In Spain, Inigists, from the word Inigo, which in Spanish means Ignatius. In France they were immediately called Jesuits. Immediately after receiving the papal permission, Ignatius summoned his comrades Lainez, Salmeron, Coger, Luget, and Bruet to Rome to elect a general. They alone could appear. Xavier and Rodriguez had left election lists before leaving for Portugal. Lefebvre sent his, and Bobadilla confirmed the election. As was to be expected, Ignatius was elected. He seemed astonished and wanted to refuse, but finally yielded to the general wish and accepted the command of the new army. He was worthy of this high position, if not by his learning, then by many other qualities which made him a perfect spiritual knight. He was of medium height and, according to his disciples, knew how to walk so that his lameness was hardly noticeable. He had a bald head, a thin olive face, a large forehead, and shining deep-set eyes. There was something strange in his physiognomy. Admirers found in him the features of a great and holy man. Indifferent people were more inclined to see in him a dreamer, an exalted man, guided in his affairs not so much by reason as by an eccentric imagination. Ignatius assumed command of the order in 1541, on April 17th, the feast of Easter. On the 22nd, all the members of the order went to the basilicas of Rome. They chose the Basilica of St. Paul extramuros as the place to make their solemn vows. When all the knights had assembled, the general celebrated Mass on the altar of the Blessed Virgin, whom they had chosen as their lady. Before the communion, Ignatius turned to the people, holding in one hand the wafer, host, and in the other, a promise of oath written in his own hand, which he read in a loud voice. Here is its content. I, Inigo de Loyola, promise God and our Holy Father, the Pope, his vicar on earth, in the presence of the Blessed Virgin and all the heavenly host and you, brothers, that I will forever observe poverty, chastity, and obedience, living according to the rules indicated in the bull of the confirmation of the Order of Jesus and in the rule of this order. In addition, I swear special obedience to the pontiff regarding the missions indicated in the same bull, and also that I will take care to instruct little children in the rules of the Catholic faith. Having pronounced this oath, he received Holy Communion. Then turning to his kneeling companions, he accepted their promises and communed them all in turn. Their vow differed from that given by Ignatius only in that they promised to obey the general directly, and not the Pope, to whom they obeyed less than the general. After the Mass, they went to the high altar in the name of St. Peter and St. Paul, and there Ignatius received the oath of allegiance from his knights, who kissed his hand as a sign of complete submission and obedience. The vow of poverty taken by the Jesuits did not prevent them, soon after the establishment of the order, from accepting the enormous estates of Peter Cotes, who had joined the new society. Cotes was an officer at the papal court. Thanks to his connections, he brought large donations to the order, and the new beggars immediately had the opportunity to engage in the salvation of souls without worrying about tomorrow. And Paul III himself, who loved the Jesuits, managed to provide for them from want, entrusting them with various positions. Rodriguez was at the Portuguese court, Xavier went to India as a papal legate, Lefebvre went to Spain, Bobadilla and Luget to Germany, Salmeron and Bruet to Ireland, Linez to Venice. All of them received confidential assignments. These first Jesuits were mixed up in all the affairs of that time. Paul III sent them from Germany to Spain, from Italy to Ireland, and they executed his orders so promptly and zealously that they more and more deserved his confidence, and at the same time acquired more and more influence, which they used to strengthen and spread their order. At this very time Ignatius was working at Rome on the rule of the order. In this work he was assisted by Linez, who succeeded him as general, and who thenceforth became an important personage among the Jesuits. We must acquaint the reader with this famous rule, so variously estimated. Chapter 2. The Jesuits say that they received their rule from above, through the agency of their holy founder. This is how Ignatius, according to the historians, proceeded when he wished to be sure of God's approval. Having written an article, he first discussed it himself, then turned to the Blessed Virgin, his lady, and asked her to ask God what his opinion was on the article. Confident that he would learn what he wanted, he placed the manuscript on the altar during Massachusetts. If God said nothing, this was taken as approval of the article, which became a revelation from above. Thus he inquired of God for 40 days in succession, when it came to such difficult points as, for example, whether the houses of the professions could enjoy a certain income, or whether they should live on alms alone. Ignatius was also very concerned about the appearance of his knights. Finally, he drew up the following rules. To bow the head a little forward, without hanging it to one side. Do not raise your eyes, but keep them always below the eyes of those with whom you are talking, so as not to see them directly. Do not wrinkle your forehead or nose, and have a look that is rather kind and contented than sad. Do not press your lips too tightly, but do not keep your mouth open. Have an important gait. Before drawing this portrait of the Jesuit, Ignatius cried very hard and prayed fervently 7 times. He himself told his disciples about this, at least they claim this. According to the indisputable rule of the Jesuits, it is impossible to distinguish the decrees coming directly from Ignatius from those made subsequently by Lainez and other generals. Therefore, we will present an analysis of the statute, without worrying about the time of the composition of this or that article. We will only note that in it one immediately encounters a strange contradiction that requires an explanation. According to the original statute of Ignatius, the members of the order were protected from the arbitrary exercise of the general. Lainez destroyed these guarantees at the very first general meeting, when he was elected as Ignatius's temporary assistant. Meanwhile, the original statute was not literally violated, so that the Jesuit statute simultaneously included both a limited monarchy and an unlimited monarchy. But since the changes introduced by Lainez and other generals were newer than the original rules, they deprived the latter of their force, and after Ignatius's death, the system of government in the order became unlimited. The Jesuit order is therefore an absolute monarchy. The king, under the title of general, enjoys unlimited power. He is elected for life. The members of the order are bound to obey him blindly, without questioning his orders. He can issue new laws, cancel old ones, or exempt from their observance if he pleases. He convenes general assemblies, presides over them, and has 2 votes. Nothing can be done without his consent. He distributes all places and positions. The General Assembly appoints only his assistants and the administrator after the election of the general himself. The assistants constitute the general's secret council and his ministry. They are representatives of the great provinces of the order and bear their names. Thus, there is an assistant of France, Spain, etc. Their purpose is not only to assist the general in the affairs of government, but also to watch over him and his actions. They have the right, in addition to the general, to convene a general meeting and even to deprive him of his rank, upon receipt of election notes from the provinces. In addition to these assistants, there is an administrator or exhorter near the general, whose job it is to secretly point out to the general any irregularities he may notice in his actions. The same system of espionage that surrounds himself, the general applies, in turn, to all the officials of the order, to all the members, and even, through these members, to persons not belonging to the order. For the general, espionage is of little danger, since he will always be able to protect himself from the danger of unlimited power, which subjects the assistants and the administrator to him, as well as the other members of the order. He can always enter into an agreement with them and rule despotically, and nothing of his conduct will be revealed. Moreover, since the general has the right to cancel all rules and replace them with others without asking anyone, nothing prevents him from canceling what is inconvenient for him, and from creating from the assistants and the administrator slavish executors of his will. So it happens, and so it should be. If the general leaves Rome on important business, or if through illness or old age he can no longer govern, he is replaced by a vicar general whom he himself chooses. Every general is obliged to choose his vicar during his lifetime, so that in case of his death the order will not remain for a moment without a head. If this were not done, then the professors of the 4 vows who were in Rome at the time of the general's death would have to choose a new one as soon as possible. The order is divided into provinces. Each province has a governor, called provincial. His duty is to take care of the prosperity of the order and the execution of the rules and orders issued by the general. He appoints teachers for novices, prosecutors, spiritual prefects, prefects of studies and health, preachers, confessors, consultants, administrators to the superiors, professors of colleges, professors and first ranks of the universities, in addition to rectors and chancellors, who are chosen by the general, as well as vice-provincials, abbots of the dormitories of professors and novices, and also rectors of colleges. In some cases, the provincial has the right to make these appointments instead of the general, but all of them, without exception, must be confirmed by the general himself. The provincial enjoys unlimited power over the novices, excluding those who are chosen by the general himself or bring great benefits to the order. Each provincial has 4 assistants, one of whom acts as an administrator. They are appointed by the general and secretly report to him on all the actions of the provincial. At the head of each dormitory of professors stands a superior or abbot, directly subordinate to the provincial. The abbots must vigilantly watch over all members of the dormitory for the strict observance of the charter, punishing any violation of it. Rectors enjoy the same rights in the colleges as superiors in the monasteries of professors. Both the chief prefect of the pupils and the lower prefects are subordinate to them. In addition to organized espionage, the general sends out commissioners or auditors to all the provinces of the order to inspect the monasteries and correct their shortcomings. These auditors listen to the denunciations of the superiors on the inferiors and vice versa. They report everything to the general, who acts at his own discretion. Each province, each community of professors, each novice institution has its own special procurator, who is in charge of the property and donations. The chief procurator supervises the procurators of the provinces, and these, in turn, supervise the management of the procurators of the individual monasteries. The duty of the procurator is to collect alms from house to house. He must try with all his might not to forget a single benefactor, and to increase their number. He must conduct his business so cleverly as not to bother them with his visits, and to be able to gain their favor in order to extract more benefit from them. The highest dignitaries of the order have at their disposal a whole crowd of subordinates, such as examiners, to whom those wishing to enter the order must apply, chiefs of novices, who are responsible for testing them and guiding them, ministers, who assist the abbots in matters of governance, sub-ministers, who are in charge of the kitchen, wine cellar, refectory, and rooms, advisors, who help the abbots with advice, administrators, who point out to them the mistakes they make, spiritual prefects, who teach new ones spiritual exercises, ecclesiastical prefects, who oversee the temple and warn about fasts and holidays, prefects of table readers, who teach the latter and watch, in particular, over their pronunciation. Finally, the prefects of health, the library and the dining room, the clergy, the hospital attendants, the doorkeepers, the clothing managers, the buyers, the distributors, the cooks, the wakers, the cell auditors. The duties of all these ranks correspond to their names. The members of the order are divided into 6 classes: novices, pupils or scholastics, secular coadjutors, spiritual coadjutors, professors of the 3 vows, professors of the 4 vows. The last named, in fact, constitute the order in the strict sense. They know all the secrets of the order, and they can occupy the highest offices. Their number is very limited. The professors of the 3 vows are also quite few. The mass of the order consists of young people or clergymen who have taken, without much solemnity, a vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience, from which vow they can be released by their elders. They are connected with the order, but the order is in no way connected with them. They are Jesuits in appearance, but in reality they are not Jesuits. They are assistants used by the leaders of the order, who are bound to blind obedience, and who know nothing of the motives of their superiors. There are 3 classes of novices: those who are destined for the clergy, those who will occupy secular positions, and the indifferent, from whom the authorities may, at their discretion, make either priests or simple brothers. Brothers, or secular coadjutors, are admitted to solemn profession after a 10-year probation, and upon reaching the age of 30. Spiritual coadjutors also take simple vows, but the degree they have attained allows them to be entrusted with the duties of preachers, rectors of colleges or residences, missionaries, or other secondary positions. Professors of the 3 vows are persons who are not yet considered worthy to enter the sanctuary of the order, but who can already render good services to the order. They are not yet sufficiently tested to be placed at the complete disposal of the Pope, admitting them to the 4th vow. The general must still have unlimited power over them. Only persons so devoted to the order are included in the category of professors of the 4 vows that the general has nothing to fear from their 4th vow. However, out of excessive caution, the statutes oblige a professor of the 4 vows, in case of any doubt, to apply for their resolution rather to the general than to the Pope. Moreover, he has no right to apply to the Pope without the general's permission. Moreover, the vow of obedience to the Pope has in mind exclusively missionary activity. The professors of the 4 vows and their communities must not have any property, but they live with the other members, and since the latter can own property, leaving it to the elders to use, it follows that all the communities have property, through members who have not taken the higher vows, and that the professors, as elders, dispose of both the alms received by the professors and the property belonging to the rest of the members of the order. The 3 principal duties of the professors are: they teach, preach, or govern. For the performance of these duties, they have the right to receive not a reward, but alms. These duties may also be performed by other Jesuits, but as assistants, the professors bear them by right. They renounce all spiritual orders, which they accept only by order of the Pope, under penalty of mortal sin. This rule is established so that the professors may regard themselves exclusively as Jesuits until the end of their lives, and so that the order will not be deprived of outstanding members. Ignatius set a double goal for his order: the sanctification of the individuals who comprised it, and the salvation of the souls of his neighbors. Here are the means indicated by him for achieving the first of these goals: mental prayer, strict discussion of one's actions, reading spiritual books, frequent reception of the holy mysteries, solitude. The book Spiritual Exercises lies at the foundation of all these works of piety. Here are the means indicated by Ignatius for saving the soul of one's neighbor: teaching the law of God, sermons, conversations, visiting prisons and hospitals, spiritual guidance, debates with the enemies of the Church, missionary work among Catholics and infidels, teaching the youth. According to Ignatius, his order was not strictly monastic, but a band of wandering knights who were obliged to travel around the world to fight the infidels. As a result, the charter was composed in a military spirit. It is a charter for an army. It has in mind an enemy with whom it is necessary to fight. It raises its banner, calls the warriors to arms, and teaches them the exact performance of all military exercises. The activity of the spiritual knights was not limited to the performance of divine services, abstinence, fasting, penance, as with monks. Ignatius did not even appoint a specific dress for them, leaving them the right to dress as they please, while fulfilling the tasks entrusted to them. For these military reasons, Ignatius prescribed blind obedience to his soldiers. The younger must look upon the elder as the vicar of Jesus Christ, and obey him without question. Even if the elder is inferior in intelligence and other qualities to the younger, his will and opinion must be considered law for the latter, who must be in the hands of the elder like soft wax, which takes any form, like a corpse which has in itself no movement, like a statuette, which is placed wherever one wishes, like a staff, which the elder takes up or throws down as he pleases. The younger must obey with such speed that he is obliged to leave a letter unfinished, in order to hasten where he is called. He does not take into account the degree of seniority of the one who gives the order. All elders, whoever they may be, are transmitters of the will of God. The same obedience must be observed by elders towards their superiors, so that all without exception must look upon the general as upon God himself, and obey him without the least objection. All Jesuits must renounce their own will, their own opinion, their own reason. They must be absolutely passive, and hold themselves in the state of machines, ready to be set in motion by the impulse of an engine, which alone can set them in motion, or like a ball on a level surface, rolling in any direction, according to the blow given to it, or like an echo, repeating only the sound transmitted to it. Having laid this rule as a foundation, this is how the Charter teaches how to manage a huge machine. The general will reside in Rome, the center of the Catholic world. He will always have assistants around him. They will maintain an active correspondence with the provincials, in order to be informed about the affairs of the states under their jurisdiction. The superiors of the dormitories of professors and novices, and the rectors of the colleges will write weekly to their provincial and report on everything of interest to the order. The provincials will write monthly to the general and transmit to him what the superiors and rectors have reported. Every year, in January, each provincial will present to the general a brief repetition of his 12 letters for the past year, and once every 3 years, an exact register of the institutions, indicating the number of members, from novices to professors of the 4 vows, as well as the name, age, temperament, talents, virtues or vices, perfections and shortcomings of each. Every 3 years a provincial council of rectors and the most senior professors will meet, at which a report will be made on the state of the order in the province, on its successes, on the property it has received, by will or gift, indicating the names of persons who are patrons or enemies of the order. This report will be sent to Rome through a deputy elected by the provincial assembly. In addition, this person will have to transmit orally to the general certain details which, for reasons of caution, cannot be set forth in writing. In addition to this official correspondence, each member of the order has the right to write directly to the general to present to him his needs or complaints. By means of such correspondence, the general is always informed about the affairs of the order and has at hand all the documents that can initiate him into the smallest details. Thanks to the unconditional and blind obedience of all the wheels, he can set in motion his enormous machine with a single word, which moves only at his will. This is all the easier for him, because when he encounters an obstacle in some law, he can cancel it and replace it with another, opposite to it, and that the counterweight presented by the assistants and the administrator is not effective, since these persons, equally with the rest of the members of the order, are obliged to obey him blindly. They are in his hands, and he can remove them from office. such as the internal organization of the Order of Jesus. As for its external activity, it should be noted that it obtained all sorts of privileges from various popes, so that absolutely nothing would interfere with the freedom of this activity. Here are the most important of these privileges. The Jesuits have the right to build and acquire property in all parts of the world, in defiance of any secular or spiritual authority. Their property is inviolable. It belongs to St. Peter, the Holy Apostolic See, who can dispose of it only through the order. It is free from all taxes and levies, even for the most important purposes, such as the defense of the fatherland. No king, prince, duke, marquis, baron, military leader, nobleman, layman, no community, no magistrate, no city or palace official shall dare to impose taxes on the aforementioned property or on the members of the order. The Jesuits have the right to elect judges for themselves, guardians of their privileges. Every canon, every dignitary can be elected by them to this office. He then becomes their ordinary judge. He can judge without any legal formalities. His sentence is final, and whatever any authorities may undertake against him means nothing and has no force. The elected guardian enjoys full power over the laity and their property. He can punish them with fines and even impose a ban on places where the enemies of the order are hiding. He can punish any authorities, spiritual or secular, who harm the order and disturb it in its possessions, privileges, or affect its reputation, whether publicly or secretly, directly or indirectly, under any pretext. The Jesuits may bring before their guardian judges any ecclesiastical or secular person who has caused obvious harm to them, or to their property, or to their privileges. If the judge they have chosen loses their confidence, they may choose a new one and continue with him the trial of the case begun by the former one. In this way, they are sure that they will always be right. The order can create for itself not only judges but also notaries. The general has the right to make members of the order officials, to announce to whom it is necessary about its privileges, which is accepted even by judicial places. The Jesuits are not obliged to return in full what they have borrowed, if such a return is not advantageous to them. Since only the general has the right to conclude various acts and contracts in the name of the order, it follows that he may not recognize those concluded by his subordinates. Thus, it turns out that those who conclude any contract with the order are bound by it in relation to the order, which is not bound in any way in relation to them, if the general did not participate directly in the transaction. Even if the superiors acted on his orders, he may not approve and cash out what they have done. He can change the purpose of legacies left to colleges or dormitories and give them another, if he finds it necessary. He must only try not to arouse discontent among those to whom these wills relate. The order is outside the rights of the curators of universities and other monastic orders. It is exempt and free from all supremacy, jurisdiction, and corrective measures of bishops. No bishop can remove from office or excommunicate from the church either a Jesuit or anyone else who belongs, even externally, to the order. Every Jesuit has the right, with the permission of the general, to preach everywhere, to hear the confessions of the faithful, to absolve sins, to decide all cases subject to the judgment of the Holy See, and to impose spiritual interdicts. Bishops are obliged not only not to interfere with the Jesuits, but to assist them in every way in their actions. They cannot forbid the Jesuits to celebrate the sacrament of penance during Easter week, despite the formal law, which grants this right only to parish priests and their representatives. Every bishop is obliged to admit the Jesuits in his diocese to perform services without limitation of time, place, and person. Bishops cannot, without the permission of the Pope, impose a ban on a Jesuit community, nor even on a simple Jesuit who has previously received authority. They cannot subject him to a new trial, nor forbid him to preach in the churches of the order. Those present at the celebration of Mass in these churches fulfill their duty as parishioners. No bishop has the right to interfere with the administrative activities of the Jesuits, nor even to visit their monasteries. We are not able to enumerate the mass of other privileges received by the Jesuits. It is enough to say that the bull of Pius V alone granted them all the privileges, present, past, and future, which have belonged or will belong in perpetuity to all mendicant religious orders of whatever name, male or female. All the advantages, however many, even those which require special mention, all the privileges, all the exemptions, all the means, all the dispensations, all the favors, all the spiritual and temporal graces that can ever be granted to any monastery, congregation, chapter, or their members, male or female, their dormitories, hospitals, and other institutions. All these privileges are granted to the Jesuits ipso facto, that is, by the very fact of their being granted to others, and without any special grant to them, the Jesuits. Besides these written privileges, the Jesuits have what are called oral sentences. If the Pope, in conversation or otherwise, says anything to a serious person, if he thus forbids or permits something, this becomes an oral sentence and has the same force as if it were set out in a papal letter or bull. The authority of the serious person who heard the sentence is sufficient to ensure that there is no doubt about the existence of this sentence, and that the Jesuits have the right to include it among their privileges. Finally, all the privileges of the Jesuits are inalienable, and the general has the right to ignore everything that the Pope might think to do to diminish them. After all that has been said, the reader will not be surprised that a simple list of the privileges of the order occupies 144 columns in the folio of the statutes published by the Jesuits themselves in Prague. Thus, the popes tried to make of the Jesuits an order independent of all spiritual and secular power, and subordinate only to the Holy See. Therefore, the Jesuits must be looked upon as a real state, creeping into other states in order to, having worked on them in various ways, take possession of them and assimilate them to themselves. They use powerful means to do this. In the first place, we shall place the congregations or societies, by means of which the Jesuits bind to themselves directly and with real ties a considerable number of persons living in the world and serving them as spies or intermediaries, in order to penetrate into family secrets. The general has the right to establish in all the dormitories of the order various congregations, to distribute indulgences in them, to establish statutes for them at his discretion, and to change them at will. All these statutes must be considered as confirmed by the Pope. By means of these congregations, organized in colleges, the Jesuits have added to themselves a mass of people who are now called short-sleeved Jesuits. These added ones belong to the order, participate in its privileges, and form what is called the Third Order, or tertiaries, like the Dominicans and Franciscans. Pope Paul III, in the bull of 1549, speaks of these external Jesuits, living in obedience to the general, enjoying exemptions, rights and privileges that place them in independence of the civil laws, and subject entirely to the jurisdiction of the general. These secular Jesuits are bound to the order, which does not assume any obligations with respect to them. He can renounce them if they compromise him, or if it is to his advantage. However, he does this with all his members, excluding the professors of the four vows, but the latter are very few. The Jesuits have always derived great benefit from their adherents, or congregants. They contrive to have in their persons assistants both in the clergy and in the judicial department, at the highest levels of government, among the common people and among the workers. Thanks to them, the Jesuits exert the strongest influence on the social order and enjoy enormous resources. Not content with these emissaries, they send into society, into the clergy or into the universities, some of their most powerful members by social position or by skill, entrusting them with preparing the way for the order in certain, especially important cases. These Jesuits cannot compromise the order, to which they are not considered to belong, if they commit any imprudence in the difficult affairs entrusted to them and in case of failure. Meanwhile, in case of success, the order reaps all the fruits of their labors. Before seemingly leaving the order, these emissaries take an oath of loyalty to it. Besides these congregations, the Jesuits have a powerful means of influencing society, their colleges. The popes have granted these institutions all sorts of privileges. Each college of Jesuits applies to the university. The rector or prefect has the right to grant students various degrees and all the privileges that those who have graduated from the university enjoy. Each university and each person who should dare to oppose this is deprived of their privileges and rights, and is brought before the guardian judge, who sentences them to excommunication. The pupils of the Jesuits must not apply to the universities for degrees, since they require a certain oath. The judges are obliged to carry out the will of the rector, and to patronize the persons recommended by him. Thanks to the privileges granted to their schools, the Jesuits are able to create their own special people, so to speak, connected with them by various interests, as well as by education and the congregation to which the majority of the students belong. The Jesuits do not shrink from any means to extract from their members benefit for the order. For this purpose, they use secret methods. From the edition of their statutes already mentioned, it is evident that each provincial, in addition to printed documents, must have several important manuscripts that have never seen the light of day. There was a supposition that the book entitled Secreta Munita, or Secret Councils, is one of these manuscripts, stolen from the Jesuits, despite all their vigilance. They deny the authenticity of this work, but their testimony is too suspect in such a matter. Whatever the authenticity of this book, Secreta Manita gives the most accurate picture of the methods that the Jesuits have used throughout their history to achieve their goals. Therefore, we consider it our duty to cite several extracts from it. When setting up any institution, it is necessary to try to please the local inhabitants, performing the most humble duties in hospitals, near the poor, those in prison and in grief, listening to confession without partiality and with readiness. Such a course of action will make people admire our mercy. We should not forget that it is necessary to modestly and piously ask permission to perform divine services and perform rites, and to earn the goodwill of the clergy and laity, who may be in need. The first alms received should be distributed to the poor, so that the rich become more generous to us. It is necessary that all members seem imbued with one spirit, so that they have the same manners, so as to amaze with their unity. At first, ours should refrain from buying estates except in the name of a modest friend. So that we seem poorer, lands located near any college should be attributed to distant colleges. In this way, our income will never be accurately known. For the establishment of various institutions, it is necessary to choose, preferably, rich cities. It is necessary to try to coax as much money as possible from widows, under the pretext of urgent needs. Only a provincial knows the income of each province. The treasures of the Roman court must be covered in deep darkness of secrecy. Ours are obliged to loudly declare that they do not burden anyone, like other monastic orders, that they perform their duties free of charge and without regard to person, that they devote themselves primarily to the education of children and the good of the people. We must make every effort to attract the attention and favor of patrons and the most important persons. To this end, we must conceal all the bad in their actions and give them hope of receiving, with our assistance, all sorts of privileges and permissions. In supporting a ruler, beware of saying anything definite to him. If what was intended does not succeed, we must bring forward those of us who know nothing, and who will say that the order is being slandered, being mixed up in matters of complete ignorance. In order to gain control of the ruler's mind, we must come to an agreement with those of ours who can obtain something pleasant for him from other rulers and, especially, from the Pope. We must ingratiate ourselves with his favorites and servants by bringing them various small sacred objects as gifts. This is done with the aim of learning the tastes of the rulers, in order to conform to them later. We must watch the marriages of sovereigns, so that they are offered as wives persons devoted to us. We must influence princesses through their chambermaids, and in this way find out their family secrets. In edifying princes, we must adhere to the opinions of the most indulgent authors. It is necessary to explain to the penitents how beneficial it is to confess to the fathers of the order, who have the right to grant absolution for all sins and free them from all penances. It is necessary to invite nobles to sermons, meetings, interviews, etc., dedicate poems and theses to them, and show them all sorts of courtesies. It is necessary to try to obtain everything possible from the bishops and other hierarchs, to express to them the greatest respect, so that they entrust to us the institutions that depend on them, to praise them publicly and even in writing, if they prove zealous concerning the order. They must be helped if they wish to receive any favor from Rome. They must be treated with care, especially in the case of the canonization of one of ours, in order to receive from them letters that will speed up the course of the matter at the Holy See. We must strive to obtain the office of tutor to princes. If any of ours receives the office of confessor, he must often speak of justice, declaring that he does not wish to interfere in any way with the affairs of the state, then pass on to the merits of persons who can be entrusted with high offices, and finally point out the friends of the order. To this end, ours must communicate to the confessor the names of friends, especially those who sacrifice much to the order. Confessors and preacher must treat princes gently, meekly, without offending them in any way, either in sermons or in private conversations. If these gentlemen wish to make them some small gift, they must not accept it. Let them indicate in return the province or college to which they ask to pay gracious attention. They must be content with a very simple room in the hostel, and show especially kind attention to the lowest ranks of the court, lest it be said that they are serving the nobles. As for other monks, we must patiently bear with this kind of people. Without attacking them openly, we must convey the idea that our order is a monastic order, par excellence. We must watch for the shortcomings of monks and speak of them to friends modestly and with contrition. We must point out that they perform their duties worse than we do. In particular, we must oppose those who, through schools, think of competing with the order. It is necessary to hinder their progress by every possible means. In order to take possession of a rich widow, it is necessary to choose a father who is elderly, but of a cheerful disposition, and who knows how to conduct pleasant conversation. Having disposed this person in favor of the order, he will propose that she participate in his good works and services. After joining, she will be given a confessor, whose main duty is to keep her in the state of widowhood, assuring her that she is thereby freed from purgatory. In addition, he must persuade her to arrange a chapel in her house, and thus remove worldly vanity from herself. A chaplain should be attracted to his side, and the Jesuit fathers should from time to time celebrate Mass in this chapel and give short sermons. Little by little, the old servants should be replaced by new ones, devoted to the order. Through them, everything that is happening in the house should be learned. The widow should be confessed and given communion more often. In order that she may not suspect that they wish to pass her by, she should be offered suitors whom she will certainly refuse. She should be kept away from clergy who are not devoted to the order. She should be gradually forced to do good deeds, and the confessor should make her understand that she can give alms only on his instructions. In order that these donations be assigned to the order, she should be informed of the indulgences available to the provincial and the general, and assured that she can also deserve all those available to other orders. During confession, she should be treated gently, listening indulgently to confessions of coquetry and even sensuality. If she is unwell, then penance should not be imposed on her. She should even be forbidden to go to church. She should be given small secret meetings in the house and in the garden with the fathers who especially please her. She should be forced to give a certain fixed sum annually to the order. Then she should constantly talk about the benefits of voluntary poverty, hinting that the order has to establish various institutions. In this way it will be possible to bring her to the point that she will give the order all her property if she has no children. If a widow has daughters, then she must force them to become nuns, which can be achieved through constant attacks from the mother. If she has sons, then from an early age they must be taken possession of and arranged so that they enter the order, contributing their property to it. It is necessary, in particular, to try to enrich the order, attracting to it only sons, who must be assured that they bring a sacrifice pleasing to God, leaving their parents' home and entering the novitiate. If any of them agree, he must be sent to a distant novitiate. To prove the poverty of the order, the superiors must make loans and delay the payment of their bills. If the creditor falls ill, he must be persuaded to return the receipt, and in this way the order will inherit the borrowed amount, without incurring the hatred of the heirs. It also does not hurt to borrow, at low interest, so as to give this money from yourself at high interest. In addition to the benefit derived from this, it may happen that the creditors decide to leave their money to us as property. The order can also engage in trade, hiding behind the names of rich merchants, our fellow members. It is necessary to visit dying rich men and tell them that, like water that quenches fire, alms quenches sins. It is necessary to teach wives who complain about the vices of their husbands that they have the right to hide money from the household funds in order to atone for the sins of their husbands and beg for their forgiveness. Those of us who do not try to enrich the order will be expelled from it, under the pretext of lack of vocation. It should be known in all the institutions of the order to speak ill of the member expelled, and it should be said everywhere that the order does not expel anyone except for important reasons. The one who is left should be closely watched, and everything in his behavior that is worthy of censure or can be badly interpreted should be made public. If nothing of the kind is found about him, he should be cast in the shadow of ambiguous words. We should pray for him, lest it be thought that the Jesuits act with bias. If the Secreta Monita is not a secret book of the Jesuits, then it must be admitted that its compiler has succeeded in depicting the means by which the Jesuits acquired their wealth and their influence. Chapter 3. While Ignatius and Linus were busy drawing up the rule, the order rapidly expanded. John III, King of Portugal, was the first to allow the Jesuits to settle in his dominions. We have already seen that Ignatius sent Francois Xavier and Simon Rodriguez to preach Christianity in India, part of which had been conquered by this king. Xavier carried out this commission. Rodriguez remained in Portugal, where he worked diligently for the benefit of the order. Rodriguez was reputedly the son of a shoemaker from Bucela, a place in the province of Beira. He was poorly educated, but distinguished by great resourcefulness and cunning. He was indifferent to the honors that were paid him on his arrival in Lisbon, and according to the rule invariably observed by the Jesuits when founding new institutions, he lived in an almshouse, lived on alms, instructed the people in the faith, and occupied himself with various charitable works. A year after his arrival in Portugal, Rodriguez founded the first Jesuit college in Coimbra. When Ignatius learned of this success, he immediately sent to Portugal some of his disciples, some of whom had been with him in Rome, or who were studying at the University of Paris. Both of them set out on foot, collecting alms on the way, and arrived in Lisbon during the year 1541. Shortly after, Rodriguez founded a college in Oporto. In less than 6 years, the Jesuits had spread over almost the whole kingdom and had acquired a mass of members by rather extraordinary means. For example, Emmanuel Godinho dressed as a student to more easily lure the young people studying at the university. Alfonso Barreto dressed as a porter, wore the ordinary clothes of these people, says the Jesuit tells, and lived among them so that they, not considering him a stranger, would accept his advice as from a friend. To please King John, Rodriguez brought disguised novices to him. The king was pleased to see them in jackets and short cloaks, with a reed in their hand instead of a staff and with a knapsack on their backs. But when Don Rodrigo de Meneses appeared in this attire before the king and queen, his sister, one of the ladies of the court, burst into tears. To these disguises, the Jesuits added public penitential processions to satisfy the superstitious tastes of the people and to earn their respect. The Jesuit Orlandini describes some of these penitential processions. Thus, for example, Rodriguez made the novices walk through the streets, carrying old lanterns and dead heads. They were ordered to cry out mournfully, something like the following words: "Hell, hell awaits those who have committed mortal sin. Earth, earth, hear the word of salvation." The people gathered in crowds to enjoy this spectacle. Children ran after the novices and insulted them. Prudent people took them for madmen, but they themselves considered themselves very wise and thought that in this way they were preparing the people for the useful listening of the sermons of Strata, the great preacher of the order, who had such success at the Portuguese court that the order soon became influential in the country and acquired numerous novices. Rodriguez tried to attract young men of noble families such as Melchior Barreto, Gonzalo de Silveira, Rodrigo de Meneses, Juan Teo de Meneses, Luis González de Camara, Leon Enriquez, and even one prince of Braganza. However, many enlightened and virtuous people did not share this passion of the court. The Lisbon bourgeoisie, nobles, and members of the university addressed the king with strong objections to the Jesuit enterprises. A strong anti-Jesuit party was formed, calling them, out of contempt, Franchinotes. The city of Oporto decreed that persons who sent their children to Jesuit schools lost their rights as citizens. The city of Evora complained to the king about the Jesuits through its archbishop, the Cardinal Infante. This archbishop was the king's brother and the Grand Inquisitor. In spite of the efforts of such a person, Simon Rodriguez retained his influence at court, where he was given the title of tutor of Prince John, the king's son. In 1543, Ignatius tried to force Paul III to change the first bull, which allowed the order to have no more than 60 members. Thus nothing hindered Rodriguez's zeal for the propagation of the order, which had the most astonishing success in Portugal. John III showered him with riches and submitted to Rodriguez, so much that he expelled forever from his dominions those whom this Jesuit called opponents of the order, and appointed the Jesuits confessors to the queen and all the members of his family. To please the king, the courtiers showed the deepest respect for the Jesuit fathers. Even the Cardinal Infante himself built a college for them in his archiepiscopal city of Evora and chose from among them a confessor. About this time, Lainez founded the order in Venice. He came to that city as a simple missionary, settled in an almshouse, lived on alms, diligently engaged in preaching and confessing the believers. He acquired a follower, the Venetian nobleman Andrea Lippomani, who ceded to him for the establishment of a college, a rich priory which belonged to him in Padua. Padua had a famous university. Imitating Rodriguez, who founded his first college in Coimbra, where the most famous university in Portugal was located, Lainez conceived the idea of opposing his order to the University of Padua, which was the pride of Italy. Paul III approved the cession of the Lippomani priory to the Jesuits, but the Venetian Senate looked at the matter differently. Lainez encountered so many difficulties that he wrote to Ignatius that he despaired of his undertaking, unless Ignatius resorted to the supernatural means at his disposal. According to the Jesuit Rabadanera, Ignatius celebrated Mass for the success of the enterprise, and all obstacles disappeared by themselves. The Senate agreed to the establishment of the college, so that even the petitions of friends were not required. When the college had thus been founded and provided for, Ignatius sent from Rome John Polankus and Andreas Frusus. The beginning of the classes was very loud, announced by the ringing of bells, as at the university. The same hours were appointed as there. Andrew Lippomani donated another house and a church to the Jesuits in Venice. Other benefactors established them in various Italian cities. Ludovico Mendoza gave them a magnificent house, gardens, and a chapel in Tivoli. Colleges were built for them in Medina and Perugia. Paul Doria, attracted to the order by Lainez, founded a college in Genoa. Cardinal Carpi did the same in Loretta. Soon Jesuit dormitories appeared in Messina, Palermo, Naples, Turin, Mantua, Florence, Ferrara, Bologna, Parma, Siena, Avignon, which at that time belonged to the papal dominions. In Spain they settled down just as easily. In 1543, John III, King of Portugal, so devoted to the Jesuits, sending his daughter Maria of Portugal to Spain to marry Philip of Austria, son of Charles V, gave her as companions fathers Lefebvre and Arias, who were not slow in making the young princess the patroness of the order. The name of Loyola was not suspicious to the Spaniards. They also knew Arias well, who enjoyed some influence among them. Besides, he was gifted with such zeal that he did not fear any difficulties. At that time, Francis Borgia, who later became general of the Jesuits, was viceroy of Catalonia. Arias attracted him to the order, to the defense of which Borgia used all his strength. With such patrons, the Jesuits quickly covered the whole country with their establishments. The first college founded was that of Alcala, to compete with the university there. In Gandia, where Francis Borgia was duke, in Malaga, Plasencia, Compostela, Oviedo, Leon, Granada, Medina del Campo, Córdoba, Seville, Burgos, Avil, Cuenca, Salamanca, Barcelona, Murcia, Monte Reggio, Orihuela, Montiel, Oñate. Within a few years, Jesuit colleges appeared, very well provided for and possessing considerable property. Arias even founded a magnificent college at Salamanca, as if to challenge the university there, the most learned and the most famous in all Spain. The money for the construction of the building of the new college was given by Cardinal Francis Mendoza. The plans were drawn up by the Jesuit architect Michael de Toria, who was sent from Rome to supervise the work. When the college was established, he was made its rector. Proud of such a brilliant success, the Jesuits began to preach and hear confessions without the permission of the bishops, especially in Alcala, the diocese of Toledo. In order to attract penitents, they showed such gentleness that one could take it for indulgence. The first warning against the new confessors came from Salamanca. At the same time, the Archbishop of Toledo was informed that the Jesuits were confessing and preaching without his permission. He did not consider himself obliged to take into account the privileges granted to the Jesuits by the Pope, imposed a ban, threatened with excommunication all those who confessed to them, and forbade the clergy of his diocese to allow the Jesuits to perform rites and worship. According to Rabadinira, Ignatius, upon learning of this, was rather glad than saddened. He saw in the contradiction the germ of success, which did not prevent him from writing to all the patrons of the order, who by their influence could calm the rising storm. He achieved his goal. In the meantime, the Archbishop of Toledo died, and the patrons of the Jesuits obtained for them in Toledo the house which the deceased prelate had built for his clergy. "Oh, what an amazing event!" exclaims the same Jesuit biographer. "The primate of Spain is doing everything he can to drive us out of his diocese, and without knowing it, he is building a magnificent palace for us in his own metropolis." In Saragossa they met with more resistance than in the diocese of Toledo, and they won a still more brilliant victory. They were called there by Don Juan Gonzalez, protector of the Kingdom of Aragon, and the Bishop of Guettée. Thanks to the patronage of such influential persons, and relying on the privileges granted by the Pope, they paid no attention either to the local authorities or to the privileges of other monks. They began to build a chapel without asking anyone, and in a place that was under the jurisdiction of the Augustinians. These monks ordered the work to be stopped. The Jesuits hastened it. Soon the chapel was finished, and everything was prepared for its consecration. On the appointed day the great vicar of the Archbishop forbade the service. His words were ignored, and Mass was celebrated in the chapel with great solemnity. The enraged Grand Vicar forbade the people, under pain of excommunication, to attend the services of the Jesuits, had his order nailed to their doors, and sent to all the parish priests to be read to the people during the sermon. This measure did not seem to him severe enough. He excommunicated the Jesuits, with the mournful ringing of bells, and with all the rites appropriated to this ceremony. This had a profound effect on the people. Everyone fled from the Jesuits as from lepers. Engravings were published in which they and the Bishop of Guettès were depicted in the clutches of the devil, who was throwing them into the fires of hell. At every step they were heaped with insults. They were even disturbed in their homes. Their doors were broken, and their windows were smashed with stones. The people would have killed them if they had not taken flight. They took refuge in Pedrola, a town near Saragossa, and informed their protectors of what had happened, who threatened the archbishop with the king's wrath if he did not revoke the order of the grand vicar and lift the excommunication from the Jesuits. The terrified archbishop did everything that was required of him, and prepared a solemn return for the Jesuits to compensate them for the insults they had suffered. The grand vicar, senators, judges, royal officers, nobles, and vast crowds of people came out to meet them. Magnificently decorated mules were brought to them. Each Jesuit was accompanied by 2 nobles, and in this order they were conducted home, where the viceroy and the inquisitors awaited them. The Bishop of Guettès celebrated a solemn mass of thanksgiving on the occasion of their return. At the same time, the Jesuits were settling in the Spanish Netherlands. They purchased the house of a rich citizen in Louvain, but left the city to go to Portugal to help Rodriguez, while Lefebvre remained in Belgium with a very small number of Jesuits, awaiting more favorable circumstances. Soon they won over to their side King Philip II, the Dukes of Alba and Parma, the Marquis of Spinola, Gomez de Figueroa, King Philip's attorney, who donated colleges and houses to them in Tournai, Anvers, Bruges, Luggich, Ghent, Brussels, Mons, Lille, Douai, Maastricht, and many other cities. At first these hostels did not prosper, since by law they could not own real property. Later we shall see how this difficulty was removed. These rapid successes of the Jesuits in Europe will not seem surprising if we consider the reasons that caused them. At the time of the appearance of the order, there was no doubt as to the necessity of ecclesiastical reform. Germany, England, France, Holland, Switzerland, in a word, all the countries not subject to the courts of the Inquisition, greeted with more or less enthusiasm the courageous men who raised the banner of opposition. The Pope and the rulers were driven to the last extremity by this movement, which was assuming the dimensions of a radical and general revolution. They sought means to dispel the storm that was approaching them. They decided to resort to the sword, but they seemed to understand that force in itself would do nothing against the idea, and that persecution, by creating martyrs, would only strengthen the doctrine which they wanted to destroy. Besides, neither the Pope nor the secular sovereigns knew how to undertake the reforms. They themselves and their friends, the monasteries, the clergy living on spiritual incomes, the nobility, in the person of their younger sons, all lived by abuses. Meanwhile, it was necessary to transform. Otherwise, it was necessary to risk losing all of its benefits. This was understandable, but it would be desirable to make transformations without giving satisfaction to the rebels. Therefore, half measures and means of reconciling the opposing demands were invented. It was in this state of affairs that Ignatius appeared with his order of spiritual knighthood, whose object was to wander through the world for the enlightenment of the people, to replace university learning with a more Christian teaching, to correct the shortcomings and vices of the secular clergy and monastic orders, and to set an example of a poor and evangelical life. Paul III thought that Providence itself was sending him this army, which by an oath placed itself at his disposal. He shared his thoughts with the rulers who, like himself, wanted and feared reform. He tried to give the first Jesuits important positions, which brought them into contact with the reformers and the sovereigns. Thus, for example, Salmeron and Pusquierbru were sent to England as legates. Leguet, Lefebvre, and Bobadilla traveled around Germany on various diplomatic missions, and Lainez and Salmeron attended the Council of Trent as papal theologians. In countries where, thanks to the Inquisition, the reformers had few or no followers, the rulers received the Jesuits with delight, as an order sent by God, who would put an end to abuses without upheavals, observing the rules of faith, and thus make revolution impossible. That is why the Jesuits spread so quickly in Portugal, Italy, Spain, Sicily, and the Spanish Netherlands. They had only to show themselves, so to speak. The rulers and nobles gave them houses and provided for them. Since they especially attacked the vices of the secular clergy and other monastic orders, they satisfied the secret antipathy of the nobility, who looked with envy at the privileges and property of the monks, covering this feeling, at the root of which lay egoism, with the mask of zeal for the faith. The Jesuits themselves acknowledge that they owe their first successes to princes and nobles. In the picture of the 1st century, 12 of their order, they exclaim with delight, "Emperors and kings, moved by a very laudable rivalry to honor us, dispute with each other the right to contribute most to our glory. Considering the great benefits and favors shown by popes and kings to our order, we can think that the following prophecy of Isaiah refers, in a sense, to the order of Jesus. Kings will be your nurses and queens your nurses. You will suck the milk of the nations and will be fed at the breasts of kings." The Jesuit Orlandini praises Ignatius for acquiring property for his order through the pope, cardinals and rulers, whose favor he managed to win. Without a doubt, this patronage is the source of the miracle of the expansion of their order, so celebrated by the Jesuits. It was only this patronage that enabled them to overcome, even in the lands of the Inquisition, the numerous obstacles that they encountered on their way. They themselves admit in their writings that they everywhere encountered the opposition of the universities, the secular clergy, and the monastic orders. But at the same time, they declare that the universities acted in this way only from a desire to conceal their ignorance, the secular clergy from a desire to justify their vices, and the monks from continuing their dissolute life. They say this openly in their picture of the 1st century of the order. Had the universities fallen so far that they feared the learning of a few strangers who had acquired their knowledge in them and who had never shone with erudition? Did the clergy and the monastic orders attach great importance to priests who were no more distinguished than others for their virtues? The assurances of the Jesuits are perhaps too absolute. They cannot touch upon some of their opponents, who were more distinguished than they in learning and virtue, and such were to be found from the very beginning, and even in the countries where the Jesuits had had the most success. Thus, in Spain, the virtuous and learned Dominican Melchior Cano rose against them with an energy which no one has since displayed to such a degree. Melchior Cano was especially famous for his writings, which earned him one of the first places among Catholic theologians. He taught theology at the University of Salamanca and contributed most importantly to the brilliant glory of this institution. When the Jesuits appeared, he loudly declared that the end of the world was approaching, since the forerunners and messengers of the Antichrist were appearing in the bosom of the Church. Not only in conversations, but also in sermons and public lectures, he called the Jesuits hypocritical enemies of religion and applied to them the following prophecy of the Apostle Paul. "Know this, that in the last days perilous times will come. For men will be lovers of themselves, lovers of money, boasters, haughty, blasphemers, disobedient to parents, ungrateful, unholy, unloving, unforgiving, slanderers, incontinent, brutal, despisers of good, traitors, heady, high-minded, lovers of pleasure rather than lovers of God, having a form of godliness but denying the power thereof. From such turn away. Of this class are they who creep into houses and deceive women loaded with sins, led away by divers lusts, always learning and never able to come to the knowledge of the truth. As Jans and Jambers withstood Moses, so these also resist the truth, men corrupt in mind, ignorant concerning the faith. But they will not succeed much, for their madness will be revealed to everyone, as happened to them. Evil people and deceivers will grow worse in evil, misleading and being misled." Melchior Cano's references to the writings were harmful to the Jesuits, especially since the virtue of the learned Dominican was well known. Not only the people, but even the nobles were astonished. In Salamanca, everyone began to fear the Jesuits. They pointed fingers at them and began to think about whether to expel such dangerous people from the city. Ignatius was informed of what was happening. He instructed Turian, who had previously been a friend of Cano and had become a Jesuit, to show the famous professor the bulls that testified in favor of the order. At the request of the Pope and Ignatius, the Dominican general issued a letter of recommendation to the Jesuits. Turian carried out the task entrusted to him, but without success. Cano replied that he considered himself obliged in conscience to warn the people that in the depths of the Church were hiding its worst enemies. Melchior Cano was appointed Bishop of the Canary Islands. It is said that he owed this honorable exile to the intrigues of the Jesuits. They wanted to remove him from Salamanca, where he was more dangerous as a professor than in the Canary Islands as a bishop. The change of situation did not make Cano, like many others, change his opinion of the Jesuits, and he wrote to the confessor of Charles V, "God grant that what happened to Cassandra, whose prophecies were believed only after the capture and burning of Troy, may not happen to me. If the Jesuit monks continue as they have begun, God grant that the time will not come when the kings will want to resist them and will not find any means to do so." Melchior Cano was not the only one who had such sad forebodings about the Jesuits. These people had aroused a surprising aversion to themselves everywhere, and if they had not been supported by rulers and popes for the reasons we have already mentioned, they would never have been established in the Church. Salmeron and Brou had no success in Ireland, Scotland, or England, in spite of the title of legate granted them by the Pope. In the reign of Mary, the order again tried to penetrate there, but with equal inconvenience. Luget and Bobadilla, who traveled through Germany and were under the protection of Charles V, the papal legates and several bishops, were no more fortunate than their brethren sent to England. They preached sermons on the vices of the clergy and argued with the Protestants, but the clergy were not reformed. Protestantism continued to spread, and the Jesuit order founded only one community, at Cologne, where Canisius, one of the most learned members of the order, became famous. Meanwhile, Ignatius was very anxious to introduce his order into Germany. At last he succeeded in obtaining the patronage of Ferdinand, the successor of Charles V. This emperor permitted the Jesuits to establish a college in Vienna, then two more, in Innsbruck and Prague. Albert of Bavaria built them two more, in Munich and Ingolstadt. To this city Ignatius sent Salmeron, Luget, and Canisius to teach Holy Scripture and theology. The lectures of the new professors could not erase from the minds of the people the impressions of the sermons of the reformers. Having established themselves in Germany, the Jesuits spread there, and gradually established their colleges in the main cities, such as Mainz, Trier, Graz, Halle, Dellingen, in the northern German provinces, in Poland and Hungary. To support these institutions, Ignatius came up with the idea of establishing a German college in Rome. The popes approved this idea, the college was created, but the results were less than expected. The Jesuits tried to get into Holland disguised as merchants. This ruse was discovered, and they had to leave, due to the severe regulations directed against them. Nor were they fortunate in France. Immediately after the order had been confirmed by the Pope, Ignatius sent some of his disciples to Paris, under the pretext of studying at the university there. They were Spaniards. The most important of them were Oviedo, Iguila, and Dompec. When Francis I ordered all the subjects of Charles V to leave France, most of the Jesuits went to Flanders and helped to spread their order in the Spanish Netherlands. At the end of the war between Francis I and Charles V, they appeared again in France. At their head was Paul Achilles. Pusquier Brou was sent to Paris to strengthen their position. In 1541 they were again expelled as Spaniards. Then two Frenchmen, Vial and Pelletier, joined the order, who settled with 11 brothers in the College of the Lombards. In the meantime, the first sessions of the Council of Trent began, of which more will be said shortly. Laines and Salmeron were present as theologians of the Holy See. They managed to ingratiate themselves with Guillaume Duprus, Bishop of Clermont, the natural son of the famous Duprus, who, after being Chancellor of France, Cardinal and Legate, decided to buy the papacy for himself. Bishop Duprus declared himself the patron of the order and founded 2 Jesuit colleges in his diocese, at Bailom and Mauriac. These first institutions did not promise any future for the Jesuits. Therefore, they begged their patron for a house in Paris on the Rue Saint-Jacques, and under cover of the noise settled in it. Soon after, their patron left them, by his will, a considerable inheritance, and they bought houses to enlarge their institution. Delighted by this beginning, Ignatius hastened to write to Vial to accept the tonsure from Guillaume Duprus, who had sent the abbot of Saint Genevieve to take his place. In the manuscript history of this abbey, it is said that Ignatius gave this order to Vial because the latter, being the only Frenchman among the Parisian Jesuits, was the only one who could legally accept the property bequeathed by the Bishop of Clermont. Vial was publicly tonsured in the church of the Abbey of Saint Genevieve by the abbot, who celebrated a solemn mass. Duprat was rich, and therefore an excellent patron of the order, but not influential enough at the French court to give his Jesuit friends the political position they enjoyed in Portugal, Spain, and Italy. Ignatius turned his attention to the family of Lorraine, and succeeded in establishing between this house and the order relations, the fruits of which we shall soon see. The Lorraines were then playing the most brilliant part in France. The Duke of Guise was a brave and skillful warrior. Cardinal Charles de Lorraine XV was a cunning diplomat. Both were very ambitious. They considered themselves the legitimate heirs to the throne of Charlemagne, unjustly taken from their family by Hugo Capet, whose origin they attributed to the princes of the Second Dynasty. In anticipation of favorable circumstances for the successful presentation of their rights, the princes of the House of Lorraine approached the throne. They exercised such influence at court and carried on such intrigues there that the Capetian kings would have fallen victims to them, had not the machinations of the Lorraines been destroyed by the cunning of the Medicis. Ignatius met Cardinal Charles of Lorraine in Rome and acquired his patronage for the order. Upon his return to France, the cardinal obtained charters from Henry II in January 1550, in which the king recognized and approved the bulls received by the Jesuits and permitted the said brothers to build a dormitory and college in the city of Paris only, but not in other cities, with the funds collected through alms, in order to live in them according to their own statute and rule. In addition, Henry II ordered the Parliament to verify their charters and to allow the Jesuits to enjoy the aforementioned privileges. The Jesuits hastened to present these charters to the Parliament. The prosecutor and the solicitors gave unfavorable opinions. The prosecutor general was Brusler, whom the learned doublet calls the Cato of his century. The solicitors were Marillac and Seguier, renowned in the judicial world for their knowledge. They set forth in writing their opinion on the necessity of not allowing the settlement of the Jesuits and the examination of the charters. In any case, the Parliament should be begged to make a representation to the king not to grant permission for these buildings, finding that the establishment of a congregation is not only unnecessary, but even superfluous. They pointed out that the bulls allowed the Jesuits not to pay any taxes on property, and in conclusion they added, "They say in their charters that they want to preach the faith of Christ in Moria. This is very good, but if they really intended to do this, they would have no need to ask permission." Before the Parliament had considered these opinions, the Jesuits, through Cardinal de Lorraine, had obtained a copy of them, and through the same cardinal obtained an order to register the charters. Only registration could give them the force of law. The Parliament, the guardian and enforcer of the laws, was guided in its decrees only by what had been entered in the registers with the legal formalities. Brusler, Marillac and Seguier presented the new opinions to the Parliament on January 26, 1552. Before writing them down, Seguier made a speech that made a strong impression on the judges. The second opinion at first resembles the first. Further, it complains that, contrary to all law, the interested party was informed of an act that was intended only for the Parliament and could only be discussed by the Parliament. In addition, Seguier insisted that it was necessary to present the case to the king. On that day, the Parliament made no decision. On February 8th, it decreed that the king's charters and papal bulls would be submitted to the Archbishop of Paris and the theological faculty for appropriate orders. The intrigues of the Jesuits and the influence they enjoyed at court, thanks to Cardinal de Lorraine, so alarmed the University of Paris that on February 25th it petitioned the king not to include the bulls of Paul III in the registers of Parliament, so that these bulls would not have the force of state laws. They affected all the universities, giving the Jesuit colleges the right, equally with the universities, to award their students academic degrees. University degrees were then of great importance. Only those who had received them could compete for certain positions with nobles, whose noble origin exempted them from science and virtue. All those who did not have a known noble title were obliged to take examinations in science and literature at the university in order to be admitted to occupy positions in the church of any significance. Since the Jesuits could award academic degrees in their colleges, the doors of all positions were open to their creatures, and since no one could control either their teaching or their diplomas, nothing prevented them from considering devotion to the order more important than learning, and taking it into account only when awarding academic degrees. This is the real reason why all the universities, and especially the one of Paris, refused to recognize the papal bulls granted to the Jesuits. If we are to believe the Jesuit writers, their fathers were so learned that at their appearance all the learned corporations trembled with fear, and only envy was at the root of their resistance. But if we examine the works of these first, so highly praised Jesuits, we will not find in them anything dangerous for the glory of other learned men. Some writers who have looked through the lists of the old university assure us that some of the first companions of Ignatius failed the examinations and were without scientific degrees. Consequently, the learned corporations were afraid not of their learning, but of their privileges, which they could easily abuse. The Bishop of Paris and the Faculty of Theology were not in a great hurry to send their applications to the Parliament. The Bishop of Paris was Eustache du Bellay. He was the successor of his uncle John, who had retired to Rome to escape the persecution of the princes of Lorraine, and who had died in the rank of Cardinal, Bishop of Ostia. The family of du Bellay was one of the most distinguished in the literary and diplomatic fields of the 16th century, They left notes, histories, poems. Eustache did not lag behind his uncles. The Council of Trent delighted in his eloquence. Cardinal de Lorraine had no influence over this prelate, and the Jesuits had to wait respectfully for his decision. About 2 years passed in this way, when at last the Parliament, by a new order of the king, took up their case for the third time. On August 3, 1554, it was decided to submit the Jesuit bulls and charters to the Bishop of Paris and the Dean of the Theological Faculty of the University of Paris for due consideration and report. Then Eustace du Bellay was about to present the response required of him. Here are its main points. The Bishop of Paris, to whom, by order of the king, certain papal bulls were presented together with the letters patent of the now reigning King Henry II, having made assurances befitting this place of the feelings of submission and respect which he owes and wishes to have for the Holy See and the King, says that the aforementioned bulls contain much that seems strange and devoid of sense, and which can neither be tolerated nor accepted in the Christian faith. First, the above-mentioned petitioners call themselves the Order of the Name of Jesus, which name, if one may say so, is arrogant, for they wish to appropriate to themselves alone what is proper to the Catholic and Universal Church, quod ecclesiae Catholici et ecumenicae competi, which, in essence, constitutes the assembly of the faithful, the head of which is Jesus Christ, and, consequently, it is the assembly of the name of Jesus. They apparently consider themselves alone as members of the Church as its constituents. The second objection of the Bishop of Paris is that there is a contradiction between the charters, which permit the Jesuits to have only a dormitory in Paris, and the bulls, which give them the right to establish their colleges anywhere. The charters do not determine whether the Paris dormitory will be a college or something else. If this institution is not a college, then the Jesuits, according to their statutes and bulls, cannot have any property. But if they want to establish colleges, then their students, not belonging to the order, since they have not taken the tonsure, cannot rely on the charters, which only give the Jesuits the right to have a dormitory for themselves. If they maintain that their dormitory in Paris is not a college, then they intend to live there on alms, which, in the opinion of the Bishop of Paris, is a reason for their expulsion. Considering, he says, the evil of the times and the great scarcity of alms, especially since there are many already existing and authorized monasteries and dormitories that live only on alms, to which this order would cause great harm, since it would divert donations from them, their opinion should be asked as an interested party, namely, the four beggars, the hospital for the blind, and the penitents. In the same way, harm would be done to almshouses and hospitals, and to the poor who live on alms who are cared for in them. From the fourth objection of the Bishop of Paris, it is evident that the Jesuits were seeking in their petition the right to receive ecclesiastical offices, even archbishoprics, with the permission of their general. In this they were violating the rule of their order not to accept any ecclesiastical offices. The Bishop of Paris sees in the privileges granted to the order a violation of the rights of bishops and parish priests, since the Jesuits are given the privilege of receiving reprimands and punishments only from the order itself, and of hearing confessions at any time, even at Easter, without the permission of the parish priest, which is contrary to the canon of the Lateran Council, sacredly observed in France. The Jesuits considered themselves entitled even to excommunicate, to grant permission, and even to consecrate churches. They encroached, says Eustace du Bellay, not only on the sphere of authority, but also on the very rank of bishops, and on the rights even of the Supreme Pontiff, granting permission to derogate from the rules, especially in matters concerning respect for spiritual authority, which is the right of the Pope alone. Despite the fact, continues du Bellay, that the Pope permitted them to found their order specifically for the purpose of enlightening the Turks, infidels, heretics, and schismatics, they demand for their superior the right to dismiss from office persons appointed by the Pope, which directly contradicts the vow of obedience they have given. And since the intended purpose of the order is to convert the Turks and infidels to Christianity, then, let it be allowed to say, the above-mentioned hostels and societies should be established in places neighboring these infidels, just as in ancient times they did with the Rhodian Knights, settling them on the borders of the Christian world and not in its center. Otherwise, much time would be lost in traveling from Paris to Constantinople and other Turkish cities. The shrewd, witty bishop ends his retort with this caustic witticism directed against the spiritual knights-errant, who, according to the charter, were supposed to wander throughout the world, fighting for the church and live on alms, but in reality, only thought about how to build more rich hostels everywhere and provide for them better. On September 1st, the theological faculty met in consultation to formulate a reply on the same question. At this first meeting, no decision was reached. Only all members were invited to seriously consider the matter so that they could give wise and accurate advice in due time. 2 more fruitless meetings took place, and it was not until the meeting of December 1st, 1554, that a decision was reached. Here are the most remarkable points of this conclusion. Since all the faithful, and especially theologians, must be prepared to explain to all who ask everything concerning the faith, morals, and edification of the Church, the faculty considered it its duty to satisfy the desire, request, and intention of the court. Therefore, having read and reread several times, and having well understood all the articles of both bulls, of Paul III and Julius III, and having discussed and examined them, over the course of several months, at various times and hours, as is customary, in view of the importance of the subject, the faculty unanimously passed the present decision, which it most respectfully submits to the Holy See. The new order, which has appropriated to itself the unusual name of the Order of Jesus, accepting into its membership all sorts of people, however criminal, lawless, and dishonored they may be, insults the honor of the monastic calling, completely weakens the difficult, pious, and very necessary observance of the requirements of virtue, fasts, rites, and strictness of behavior. It even allows too much freedom to leave other monastic orders, unlawfully deprives them of the authority of persons, both secular and ecclesiastical, to bring disorder, excites complaints among the people, litigations, disputes, envy, and all kinds of discord. Therefore, having considered very carefully and attentively all these things and many others, we find this order dangerous to the faith, capable of disturbing the peace of the Church and destroying the monastic order, and capable, rather, of destroying than building up. Comparing the facts of the history of the Jesuits with this remarkable conclusion, one cannot help but be amazed at the correctness of the views of the faculty. The Jesuit order had only just come into being. The scholars saw before them only unknown people, unremarkable in any way, who had success at court only because they enjoyed the patronage of an influential person, and this was enough for them to foresee the future of the order and describe it with such precision that their conclusion almost becomes a prophecy. If such serious people as the members of the Sorbonne, so openly and in such a document, which was intended for the Supreme Tribunal, Parliament, and was to receive such publicity, said that the Jesuits, in order to increase the number of their brothers, accepted criminal, lawless, and dishonored people, then, obviously, they had very weighty proofs of this. It is not surprising that various abuses arose so quickly within the order itself, which quickly distorted it and gave rise to energetic protests in its very midst. The Jesuit Orlandini relates that Ignatius, having received in Rome a copy of the report of the faculty, assembled his disciples who were with him to discuss the matter. All advised him to defend the order and justify it in the accusations brought against it. Ignatius alone advised silence. He used all means to achieve good results. Pusquier-Bru went to Paris to conduct the matter with his usual dexterity. The failure suffered, in spite of the precautions taken, did not allow him to hope for any success in the struggle with the theological faculty. The policy and interests of the order demanded the most profound silence. However, when in 1555 Cardinal de Lorraine arrived in Rome with 4 doctors of theology, Claude Despens, Jérôme de Souchiers, Crespin de Bermanto, and René Benoist, Ignatius proposed that they interview Fathers Olav, Linez, Poulenc, and Fruzes. Orlandini claims that the 4 doctors were forced to admit that the faculty had given its opinion without proper knowledge of the matter. To consider this fact as reliable, a more impartial testimony than the words of a Jesuit would be required. However, the conclusion of the faculty made a great noise in Paris. Preachers attacked the Jesuits from the pulpit, parish priests did the same, professors imitated them in their lectures. Their teaching and their behavior were equally condemned. Eustace du Bellay and other bishops who were in Paris imposed an interdict on the Jesuits. On the other hand, the Spanish Inquisition forbade the conclusion of the faculty, although it was signed by Dr. Ory, the Grand Inquisitor of the faith in France. The Jesuits saw that they must give in to the disgust they had caused and hide themselves, awaiting more favorable circumstances. For 6 years they waited for the moment when they could renew their intrigues with greater success, and during this time they carried out their duties on the territory of the Abbey of Saint Genevieve, which was not subject to the jurisdiction of the Bishop of Paris. During Ignatius' life, the Jesuit order had spread not only in Europe, but had penetrated into Asia, Africa, and America. We must give an account of its activities in these countries. In the 16th century, the glory of the Portuguese thundered throughout the world. Ever since Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope, they had founded colonies on the shores of India and Ethiopia as far as the Chinese border. These conquests were marred by unheard-of cruelties and robberies. The Portuguese applied the law of the strongest to defenseless tribes. Countless treasures flowed from India to Portugal, and greed attracted crowds of ambitious men and adventurers to these distant lands. Priests followed them, under the pretext of spreading the Christian faith, but, in reality, for their own enrichment like everyone else. Having heard of the Jesuits from Mascarenhas, his ambassador to Rome, King John III thought that these new monks, who had taken a vow of absolute poverty, would be true apostles, moved solely by the Spirit of God and the desire to draw hearts to Christ. We have already said that Ignatius sent to the King Xavier and Simon Rodriguez, who remained in Portugal, as we have also mentioned. Francois Xavier went to India in 1541 with Alphonse de Souza, who was viceroy of all the Spanish possessions in that country. Xavier was invested with the title of legate of the Holy See, and with very extensive ecclesiastical rights. He spent his first winter in Mozambique, one of the first places acquired by the Portuguese. The following summer he arrived at Goa. This was the richest of the Portuguese colonies, and was chosen as the center of civil and ecclesiastical government. From here he made journeys over all the coasts under the jurisdiction of the viceroy, and over some other countries, especially the Fisherman's Coast, Cape Camarino, the Travancore Kingdom, the Mori-Manor Islands, Ceylon, and the Moluccas. When he arrived in any town, he walked through the streets with a bell in his hand. Children ran to him. He taught them to cross themselves and taught them to recite by heart the Our Father, the Hail Mary, the Creed, the Confiteor, and the Salve Regina. He himself translated all these prayers, as best he could, into the language of the Paravasians, which he knew a little. When the children had learned these prayers, he ordered them to teach their parents and neighbors the same. The pagans did not resist. As soon as they had learned the prayers, they were baptized. Such conversions were very fragile. One might even think that the new Christians were guided rather by fear than by faith, since Xavier often appeared accompanied by soldiers who destroyed the temples and altars of idols. Then he built chapels and went to another country, where he preached the gospel in the same way, usually with the help of interpreters. Returning to those places where he had left the Christians and the chapels, he very often found temples and idolaters again. One day, in a fit of zeal, he forced the children to set fire to the house of a convert who had returned to his idols. To save himself from disaster, this man found no better way than to hand over his gods, who were turned into ashes. However, Xavier understood that such executions could not be carried out often, and he conceived the idea of establishing an Inquisition court in Goa, in order to instill such fear in the natives that they would not allow them to return to their former, pagan faith. It must be acknowledged that in all his actions Xavier showed a zeal and disinterestedness truly worthy of praise. He had the virtues of an apostle. He was full of faith, and in all his labors he was guided only by the desire to lead the Indian tribes out of the darkness of error and barbarity. But was it as easy as he thought to bring to Christ the poor savages, who had inherited from their fathers all sorts of superstitions, who looked upon their religion as a sacred heritage of their ancestors, and saw in Christianity only the religion of those people who deprived them of wealth and freedom? Xavier could not even enter into direct communication with them. He knew only a few words of their language, and appeared among the various tribes only for a short time. And yet these new converts could only become Christians in time. The light of truth had not yet dawned upon their minds, and baptism was often a simple courtesy to the conquerors. Consequently, one cannot help but be grieved that Xavier wrote to the Portuguese king asking him to support his preaching with force, and to allow him to deprive of property and life those who should show the slightest inclination to return to their idols after receiving baptism. He demanded bloody measures, performing works of mercy and meekness. Therefore there was an excessive zeal in him, but there was no cruelty. One cannot help but regret that he was the first instigator of the Inquisition in Goa, although its tribunal was actually opened in 1560. Xavier found that the Viceroy Alphonse de Souza was not giving him sufficient support, and wrote to the Portuguese king, "I beseech your Majesty, by your zeal for the glory of God and the eternal salvation of your soul, to send here a vigilant and courageous minister, who would take the conversion of the pagans to the true faith most closely to his heart." Jean de Castro replaced Souza. He was ordered to tolerate no superstitions, to destroy all pagodas, to expel the Brahmins, and to patronize missionaries and converts. In 1545, during a missionary journey to Malacca, Xavier learned of the arrival of 3 Jesuits sent to him by Ignatius. He chose Lancelotti to teach Latin at the College of Saint Foa in Goa, and sent Criminal and Berra to the fisherman's coast. Soon other Jesuits arrived: Paul de Camerino, Henriquez, Alphonsus Cyprian, Cosmas de Torres, and some others. Xavier gave each a special assignment, while he himself continued to travel through the Maluku Islands. Jesuit historians relate that he performed astonishing miracles everywhere, converted masses of pagans to Christianity, and brought back to the path of truth fallen Christians who had forgotten the duties imposed on them by the baptism they had received. For several centuries, India had been visited by European missionaries, especially Franciscans and Dominicans, who built churches here and there and founded small Christian communities. Xavier visited them and, according to his historians, in a few days revived the faith wherever he went. One may doubt the veracity of these stories, since after Xavier's death, India was no more Christian than it had been before. Be that as it may, after 7 years of wandering along countless coasts and islands, Xavier set off for Japan in 1549. We learn the details of Xavier's missionary travels only from the writings of Jesuit writers, whose stories are far from satisfactory. They describe thousands of romantic adventures of the hero. In places it is mentioned that neither he nor his companions knew the Japanese language, and then they relate purely scholastic disputes between missionaries and bonzes. They give Xavier a murderer as a guide through the country, where he came to preach a new religion, contrary to the teaching that had taken deep root in Japanese customs, morals, and laws. Sometimes they attribute such enormous success to him that he had to baptize day and night, exhausted from fatigue, without ceasing. Sometimes they depict him as being subjected to insults and contempt of the crowd. In 1552 Xavier went to China, and died in the same year on the threshold of the vast empire which he had dreamed of converting to Christianity. His virtues are undoubted. The same cannot be said of many of his miracles. We have no reason to believe that God deprived him of the gift of performing them for the enlightenment of nations upon whom persuasion had little effect. But in the description of the Jesuits they are accompanied, at least most of them, by circumstances which give them an improbable character, and we are inclined to think that these historians have thought it useful to embellish with romantic facts a life which was beautiful enough in itself to deserve a simpler description. According to them, Xavier traveled in 10 years through 52 empires, an area of 3,000 miles, and baptized with his own hands about 1,000,000 Saracens and pagans. In the description of Xavier's life, compiled by his comrades, one is struck by the inconstancy, one might even say the frivolity, of the hero, who continually changed his intentions. Before he had time to arrive in a country, he was already rushing on, not giving himself enough time to instruct and confirm in the faith the peoples he was enlightening. Were the newly converted ready to accept baptism after listening to several sermons, poorly understood by them? Xavier's aim could not have been to pave the way for other Christian missionaries, since Dominicans and Franciscans had already been in these countries before him. The Christians he found there, according to the same authors, had forgotten their duties and the rules of faith. Could Xavier hope to create more solid Christians in a few days? If he thought so, the results proved him wrong. It would be a mistake to suppose that we wish to dispute the zeal and virtues of François Xavier. We wish only to say that the numerous details transmitted by Jesuit writers and their copyists do not, in our opinion, enjoy all the guarantees of authenticity desired by a true historian. If, as we shall prove, the Jesuits, having declared that Ignatius did not work miracles, could nevertheless attribute miracles to him, and moreover, in Europe and, so to speak, before the eyes of eyewitnesses, then all the more could they distort the actions of a missionary whose activity took place in distant countries, and whose witnesses could not be interrogated. After the death of Xavier, many Jesuits remained on the islands and shores of India. According to the same historians, they accomplished numerous conversions. However, both then and now, India remained a pagan country, despite the efforts of the missionaries who were there. This indisputable fact does not fit in with such brilliant successes. In addition, those conversions of pagans that the Jesuits attribute exclusively to themselves are disputed by missionaries of other monastic orders, especially the Capuchins, who declared the stories included in the edifying and curious letters published by the Jesuits to be romantic lies. According to the Capuchins, the Jesuits brought disorder into their missions, destroyed the good done by the Capuchins, and waged a continuous struggle not only with simple missionaries, but even with bishops who did not want to submit to their yoke. We shall have to cite later the accusations brought before the Holy See against the Jesuits by bishops and missionaries of other ecclesiastical and secular congregations. For now it is enough to mention them. Xavier had little success in Japan, but after his death the Jesuit order spread in that country, thanks to its trade relations with Portugal. The Japanese princes, vying with each other to attract Europeans, granted them great privileges, which ensured their trade, personal safety, and religion. The Jesuits and other monastic congregations took advantage of these favorable circumstances. Many of the natives accepted Christianity, especially in the principalities of Bungo, Arima, and Omura, whose princes themselves were baptized. They sent an embassy to the Pope in 1585. The following year, there were 200,000 Catholics in Japan, which forced the emperor, as the supreme ruler of the country, to forbid his subjects, under pain of death, to accept Christianity. We will see further the consequences of this decree. From 1549 the Jesuits followed the Portuguese and the Spaniards into America. They preached and built churches amidst the horrors of the lawless war of conquest of America, in which the Europeans proved more cruel than the savages. It was a good thing to bring the light of the gospel and civilization to the natives of America, but should not the Jesuits first awaken Christian feelings in the hearts of people who had received the name of Christians at baptism? In 1553, there were so many of them in Brazil that Ignatius founded a province of his order there. Many tribes, not so much from conviction as from fear of the victors, were baptized and completely submitted to the Jesuits, who took advantage of this mood to form small states governed by laws created by the Jesuits. We will tell their story. About the same time, these monks penetrated into Ethiopia. The Abyssinian king had entered into relations with John III of Portugal. Desiring to attract Europeans to his kingdom, he refused to receive the bishops sent to him by the Patriarch of Alexandria, and asked the Portuguese king to send Catholic priests. This powerful patron of the Jesuits asked the Pope to send him monks of this order. Ignatius chose Barreto, who received the title of Ethiopian Patriarch. Andrew Oviedo and Cornero were assigned to him as coadjutors, with the titles of bishops of Hierapolis and Nyssa. They left Rome in 1555, accompanied by 10 other Jesuits. Having decided to settle in Goa, they limited themselves to sending González Rodriguez to Abyssinia to study the country and its language. He came to the court of the Abyssinian king, whose mood had changed. The rumor of the conquests and atrocities of the Europeans in India had reached him. He was frightened by the fact that the priests he had summoned might prove to be the forerunners of the conquerors who would take possession of his kingdom, and the Pope would sanctify their conquest. Having listened to González Rodriguez in his council, he sent him away with a letter to the Portuguese king. The Jesuit returned to Goa. In 1557, Oviedo decided to try his luck again. He received permission from the king to debate with the schismatic Christians, Jews and Muslims who made up the population of the country. For 2 years, he freely preached the gospel and converted several people to Christianity. But when a new king ascended the throne, Oviedo and his followers were banished to the desert. The Pope wrote to him, and after Barreto's death in 1561, appointed him Patriarch of Ethiopia. He continued to enlighten the few blacks who lived in the desert where he had been banished. In 1547 the Jesuits went to Congo, where the Dominicans had been preaching Christianity since 1485. No sooner had they arrived than quarrels broke out among them. Diaz and Ribera engaged in trade. Savral denounced them to Ignatius, and the King of Congo expelled them from his country along with the Portuguese in 1555. Some of the Jesuits visited various African tribes in Egypt with varying success. In 1556, Melchior Núñez made his way to China. He was the first Jesuit to set foot on the land that Xavier so passionately wanted to convert. 7 years later, 3 Jesuits accompanied the embassy sent by the Portuguese king to the Chinese emperor. They succeeded in establishing themselves in the country quite firmly, as we shall see. Thus, wherever the Spaniards and Portuguese went to expand their trade and their conquests, the Jesuits followed them everywhere. Other monastic orders also sent their missionaries. A considerable number of churches were organized and provided with bishops. We will later relate the most important facts from their history in which the Jesuits were involved. Ignatius died on July 31, 1556, at the age of 65. After the order was confirmed by the Pope, Ignatius rarely left Rome. He begged Julius III for a bull confirming the bulls of Paul III and expanding the privileges of the order. After the short reign of Marcellus II, Peter Carafa, the founder of the Theatines, ascended the papal throne under the name of Paul IV. At first the Jesuits were afraid that the new pope might treat them with hostility. Ignatius hurried to his first audience. Paul IV received him with favor rather than hostility, although he did not like the Jesuits. After describing the deeds of the first general of his order, Vladimir asserts that, although Ignatius had no gift of working miracles, he was nevertheless a great saint. The last chapter of the life of Ignatius is devoted to proving that the holiest men did not work miracles. In conclusion, the author tells those who wish to be convinced of God's intervention in the organization of the order that its rapid growth was in itself the most astounding miracle. This miracle is the more questionable because the Jesuits themselves prided themselves on the fact that the nobles and great men of this world were the patrons and supporters of their order. This detracts from the miraculous nature of its institution and growth. However that may be, such are the arguments of Vladimir in his Life of Ignatius, published in 1572 by order of Francis Borgia, the third general of the order, and in 1587 by order of General Acquaviva. The testimony of Vladimir is all the more significant because he entered the order in 1540, before its confirmation, was one of the persons closest to Ignatius, an eyewitness of almost all his actions, and collected most carefully all the information concerning Ignatius. When the Jesuits conceived the idea of canonizing their founder, the testimony of Vladimir was an obstacle, since for canonization miracles of the first order are necessary. They could think of nothing better than to force Vladimir, at that time already a very decrepit old man, to give a new narrative contrary to the first. Therefore, the biographer of Ignatius published in 1612 an abridged edition of his first work, enriching it with the most miraculous facts. He apologized for not having spoken of them before, but at that time they seemed to him insufficiently reliable and attested. It is not superfluous to note that he not only passed over them in silence, but, on the contrary, asserted that they did not happen at all. However, he hoped that his pious readers, in the goodness of their hearts, would not look too closely into the essence of the matter. Therefore, many miracles appeared, and Ignatius, 50 years after his death, suddenly turned out to be such an amazing miracle worker that he only had to read a verse from Virginius, and the miracle would occur. We have no intention of disputing with Ignatius the fame officially recognized for him, but we would not be impartial historians if we concealed, regarding his miracles, an episode not devoid of its own peculiar interest. From the time of his conversion, Ignatius became a virtuous man. We believe that he was moved by good motives in founding his order. Some of the ridiculous facts of his life may even be attributed to his biographers, who were too eager to represent their founder as an extraordinary man. In any case, it seems to us that in Ignatius, even after his conversion, there always remained something exaggerated, eccentric, dependent on an ardent imagination nourished by the ridiculous novels of knight-errantry. Virtue perfects nature, but does not destroy it.